Okay, anyone opposed? Thank you. So next we'll move on and we will have our Executive Director report from DJ Seller.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning, everybody. It's good to see folks here and good to hear folks on the phone. I am going to do something that Mr. Moorman instructed me one time to never do, so I do it at my own peril. The Executive Director's report, the hard copy was put out. You all have seen it on the website. Because of the timing of this meeting, the data is November data, so it's good data and it's accurate data, but it's a little bit stale. I'll just point out at a high level, we're on track with everything we're doing. Ridership continues to look good. Our projects continue to look good. At the last meeting, we talked about a target of 20 VPRA staff members by the end of the calendar year. We did not hit that with people on board, but we did hit that with accepted offers. So as of the end of last year, we had 20 and now 21 accepted offers. So we're on track with hiring, which has been very challenging. With that said, I would like to, with the permission of the board, bypass the Executive Director's report, assuming there are no questions, and instead talk about the winter storm that hit Virginia, the Commonwealth, earlier this week, and talk about what happened, what we did, and what we're going to do after action. So any objections to that? Apologies, Mr. Moorman. Okay, then we have a PowerPoint that was not sent out that we will put on the screen with some information about the winter storm itself. Winter Storm Frida came, if we get that PowerPoint up, Winter Storm Frida came last weekend. We knew the storm was coming, and thankfully, if you can go to the next slide, when storms come, the railroads, specifically Amtrak, our two host railroads, Norfolk Southern, CSX, VRE, get together. They know the storm is on its way, and they make plans ahead of time for how to respond to the storm. Even before the first piece of precipitation fell, Amtrak dealt with the freights, dealt with VRE. Unfortunately, this was a storm that was atypical in many, many ways. First and foremost, it came on a day where the temperatures were literally 70 degrees, and the ground was warm, so there were questions about whether the snow would stick. We knew it would be a lot of snow. There was a lot of rain that came first in the warm weather, so the ground was very, very soft. Winter weather came, heavy snow brought down a lot of trees. CSX actually made the decision to close portions of the railroad. Norfolk Southern made the decision to continue to run. We made plans accordingly. We had canceled some trains and we kept some running. As you can see on this first slide, and I can promise you that picture of the locomotive with that one tree in front of it, there were literally hundreds of trees further on down the track. Lots of trees fell. Amtrak worked with CSX, with Norfolk Southern, to clean the trees. As you can see on the slide, there were over 1,000 trees cleared within the first 24 hours after the storm hit. If you go to the next slide, you get a summary of the Virginia state-supported trains that were affected. We had train 176 that left Roanoke, headed to DC. It actually made it through Lynchburg and on the way to Charlottesville, got stopped between Lynchburg and Charlottesville because of trees that fell ahead of it. Side note, behind that train was the Crescent, which is an Amtrak long-distance train that comes up from New Orleans. That train made it to Lynchburg. At Lynchburg, they made the decision to go forward because they didn't think there were many trees blocking and they thought they could clear the path, NS being the railroad. Unfortunately, that train left Lynchburg and was also stuck. So we had two trains stuck between Charlottesville and Lynchburg. At that point, the safest place for the passengers is on the train because they had power, they were warm, they had food. So the decision was made to try to clear the path going forward. When it was determined that there were many, many trees ahead and that the trains would be going into weather, the decision was made to back those trains back up into Lynchburg. Unfortunately, in the time between when the trains left Lynchburg and when they got stuck, trees had fallen behind, so they had to clear the path to shove the trains back. So that was train 176. We also had train 84 that was going from Norfolk to DC. That was blocked just north of Quantico and then eventually moved back to Quantico. Train 174 went Newport News to DC. That actually arrived in DC just on a slight delay that beat the storm. And then as you can see there were 3 trains that were canceled. Again, if you look at the picture, you can see the sheer amount of debris that was on these railroad tracks. Next slide, please. As I referenced earlier, there were other trains that were affected. We had multiple freight trains that were also blocking the path on both sides. CSX and Norfolk Southern both shut down their tracks in Virginia. Rich, I'm going to put you on the spot, but we had VRE service. The northbound trains worked fine. VRE canceled the southbound trains that were on the Fredericksburg line, so they too were affected by the storm. And then, as you can see, Amtrak had a number of long-distance trains that were also blocked, to include some that terminated in Richmond or terminated in Petersburg. Going to the next slide, we had trees falling throughout the storm. The crews were struggling to reach the trains. I think everybody heard about problems on the roads. The travel conditions were treacherous. VDOT was stressing, stay off the roads if it's non-essential travel. Even with all of those warnings, it was very difficult for the railroad crews to get out to the right-of-way and clear the path. So it was really just a very difficult event. Bruno, are you on the line? Bruno Maestri from Amtrak?
Yes.
Do you want to speak, please, just a little bit about how Amtrak responded over those 24 to 36 hours?
Sure, and you really laid out sort of the initial communication that goes on really with respect to every weather event. And as you said, this one, the meteorologist got it a little bit wrong, and it was a sort of a domino effect down the road. Speaking to, and you've sort of covered the number of trains that were a problem. We had 2 shelter in place in Richmond, and for those passengers, they were delayed a good part of the day, and we did provide, we went out and got fed McDonald's and all sorts of other food and beverages to keep people fed and also meet other needs that they had while they were on the train. The big problem was train 20, the Crescent in Lynchburg. And as you said, we left the station. And to show the intensity of this storm, at 7 a.m. On that Monday, we communicated with Norfolk Southern, and they said the infrastructure was open and clear. And by 9 a.m., 2 hours later, they reported that the infrastructure was closed. So, and that was largely due, as you said, not only to trees, but a number of power lines that were down across that infrastructure. And a good part of that infrastructure is not accessible by road, even though the roads were not very accessible. But a lot of that has to be, the maintenance folks have to get there on a highway vehicle because of where the infrastructure is. And because of all the block tracks with the trees, they couldn't get there. They couldn't get to where they needed to get. So that was a pretty large problem. Again, there were over 500 trees on that Norfolk Southern line. So we eventually did back the train into Lynchburg, train 20, and there we were sheltering in place again because that was the safest place for our customers, and we were communicating with them as we were communicated to by the host railroads, and it was uncertain as to when the railroad would be open. So obviously people were getting frustrated because we couldn't with certainty tell them when we would be starting the service again. Meanwhile, we did send some folks down from Washington to help manage the situation. We, fed breakfast, lunch, we got food. People were running out of diapers. We had a train master go out and buy diapers and formula for some of our passengers. But the fact that they had to stay overnight was not something that we anticipated, and it was unfortunate because had the situation been different, we might have tried to house them in a hotel overnight. And in retrospect, that's one of the things we're looking at in our after-action situation. We eventually, after, the train was eventually 30 hours late, and everyone eventually got where they needed to get safely. But certainly it was a terrible inconvenience. We apologize to our customers. And we're looking at this situation, particularly the communication aspect of it, because certainly everyone deserves to know what's going on. And it's not clear that we gave them all the information that was available to us, such as the fact that there were trees and power lines down in front of them. That would have been good to spell out probably in greater detail. And that's a lesson learned. And, we'll provide the board with our go-forward plan here as we finalize sort of a review of what happened in this situation, and as we come up with, what will we be doing next time? As you know, the two senators were quite upset about this, and they've written our bosses here a letter, and we'll be responding to that. And I'll share that with you, DJ, and the board, what our response is, because that'll spell out what we'll be doing differently going forward. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Super, thank you, Bruno. So that really ends the conversation about what happened. The next slide talks about what we're going to do for after action. We are going to be working with CSX and with Norfolk Southern and with Veory and Amtrak, our operators, to ensure that we learn what went well and what didn't go well during this process. As you can see from the slide, continued communication with customers is important. Making sure people have the right information. I mean, even if it's bad news, we need to make sure that the bad news is out there so folks know exactly what's going on. A lot of the challenge here, as Bruno pointed out, was just the unknown. It was not clear how much was blocking the railway, both forward and backward. And we need to do a better job of getting that information to customers. But over the course of the next couple of weeks, we'll be working with the railroads to get a detailed after-action report and here's what we need to do next time. The other issue that Bruno talked about a little bit was the conditions on board during prolonged delays. I mean, the trains are only set up for a certain amount of food and a certain amount of time. The toilets became a big issue. I think with communication, some of those concerns could have been alleviated, but more to come here. I'll open it up. I don't know, Rich, if you want to make any comments from a Veory point of view before for questions.
Thanks, DJ. I think you pretty much covered, but I do want to say, though, and I think those pictures tell a lot of tales there. It was a Herculean effort, if you will, to the maintenance away folks, the onboard train crews, and even give some credit to our passengers and stuff. I mean, this was a tough time, and particularly those maintenance away crews out there trying to clear trees, clear power lines and stuff. In a very adverse situation, I think they should be commended for their effort. Granted, yes, in any incident like this, there's always lessons learned. There's always opportunity for improvement. But I don't want to, step away from this topic without acknowledging those folks that spent, just an enormous amount of time, and particularly on the CSX RFMP line, with I-95 shut down, there was the lack of ability to be able to get those crews relieved and bring in fresh forces and stuff like that to help them dig out. So just wanted to add to that. And again, as you mentioned, DJ, we are, as VRE, we are part of that, after action debriefing, and we're all looking for opportunities for improvement. So yeah, just wanted to say that, DJ.
Thank you, Rich. And let me add to that, the onboard crews. I mean, the onboard crews expect to work their 8-hour or 12-hour shift and then go home. And the folks running the train, the onboard conductors, they stayed on the train. The onboard services folks, they were all there while many people across the Commonwealth were really hunkered down at home, dealing with power loss at their own house, taking care of their families. These folks were out there trying to make sure that our passengers got where they wanted to get safely. So yeah, you're absolutely correct. We can't lose sight of that. Let me open it up to questions. Anybody, any board members have questions on the event or what we're doing after action?
Question. Am I captured? Have we had a situation like this within the near past where, people have actually been trapped on trains for as long as, I don't remember on I-95, anybody being stuck on I-95 for 24 hours or more.
Senator Kane.
Yes, Senator Kane, yes.
This time I think it was the same, right, on the road.
He can testify, but have we had this situation before with Amtrak, with our passenger rail, or VRE, where people have been trapped? And I guess I'm asking that question.
I can just go back to about 13 years ago, if you remember, in the 2009-2010 timeframe.
Right.
We had a series of storms, 2009 in December, and then in 2010 after. The difference there was, even though those events had eventually a large accumulation of snow, the snow did not come down at a rate per hour like this storm did Monday morning. So in other words, it came down, albeit over a couple of, several hours or even a couple of day period, and the total accumulation was high. So that gave us an opportunity to essentially keep up with it, if you will. And then eventually trains were canceled and stuff, and for a couple of days to get things recovered from that. But that's the only one I can recall in 13 years, 14 years.
I agree with that. Virginia, as far as the State's Board of Trains of Virginia, have never had folks stuck on a train for this long. I mean, there was the 2009-2010 event, but there was not the warmth ahead of time and the soft ground that really brought down as many trees and power lines. Amtrak, and I don't want to speak for Amtrak, there have been times in the past where Amtrak has had situations that have had significantly lengthy delays, but this is the longest in Virginia, at least over the last 2 decades that I've been involved with Virginia Rail.
I guess I was wondering if there was, a need to store some critical items like diapers and things like that people, were in need of and were not available. Are there items that we should store on passenger trains in the event of, a lengthy delay? Maybe thinking in terms of what were some of the things, had we only known, are there some things that we may want to have, stored on trains for passengers?
That's a good point, and we'll include that in our after-action discussions. I mean, we're all advised that in your car, especially in the winter, you should have a blanket, you should have some food. That makes sense on the trains to make those kind of accommodations as well.
I think also looking at the stations as well, we had a number of people that spent the night in Staples Mill station. They were actually on, I believe, the long-distance trains. But I think that's just another area that, when we do look at the after-action review, is how maybe we can better equip our stations or have more preparations available when we expect a snow emergency.
Agreed, we'll put that in the report.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments about the winter event?
One quick question for you, DJ. So you referenced the after-action report. Will that report be then encompass in a broader sort of government-wide after-action report, or will this be solely focused within the passenger rail wheelhouse, if you will? Because obviously we're in an interconnected transportation system, obviously, and so what happens with respect to surface impacts rail and vice versa. So just curious how that review will take place and who will have the lead there.
We've spoken to VDOT on many occasions over the course of the last week about how we all as transportation could have done a better job. At this point, I'm not aware if there's going to be one Commonwealth DOT after-action report. I would imagine there will be, but I just don't know that that's happening, and rail would be a part of that.
Sure.
I do know Commissioner Britch and his team also did an incredible job of just getting out and addressing this storm. That's being looked at closely, and Virginia will have some kind of an after-action report, and we'll make sure that our information is part of that.
Thank you.
Anybody on the phone or on WebEx that also may have a question for DJ?
This is Maria Zimmerman, and I just wanted to thank you for making the time and the space to share this report with us, and certainly applaud all the work of the crews at the various railroads who were helping to respond and be responsive. While this was hopefully a somewhat unusual storm, anytime you're on Amtrak and there's a significant delay for many hours, I know I've been on some of those that have been 5 or 6 hour delays. I think the communication issue isn't just about this one event. And I think looking at it and learning from it is great, but how do we, in expanding rail throughout Virginia and really thinking about that communications piece, I know when I've been in that situation, you're looking at your app, you're looking at Twitter, you're trying to figure out where there's information you can get. And I think just, the opportunity looking forward to make sure there's a consistent, reliable, up-to-date way to get information, as you were talking about, Bruno, I think is just really important to give passengers and their family peace of mind whenever these kinds of things strike. So I hope that will also be part of this longer-term look ahead.
Thank you
So
for
more
that.
comment than a question, unless Bruno, that there are things that Amtrak is doing with that, but I just know
Yeah,
I've been
no,
in that situation, thankfully not for as long, and I would much rather be in an Amtrak station than on my car for 27 hours in a snowstorm, but curious about that longer term comms commitment.
yeah, that's a good point, and I think that the right word that you said is consistent, because, you know, our onboard people do make announcements. For example, if there's freight train delay, that, you know, we can't get by a freight train, and we know that we're gonna be late. Or, you know, frequently, there's some sort of issue with a vehicle strike on the railroad, or other situation that causes us to stop the train for some period of time. But I think it's not a consistent way of handling it, and that's what we're working on, and I think that will be part of this after-action report.
Great, thank you. Anybody else that, on the phone that may have some questions? And Jay?
No, I was just gonna, I really like the focus on communication, and I appreciate the presentation too. It was really informative seeing those trees on the track. I mean, really help anyone understand how difficult an issue it is to respond to, especially when those are such isolated locations. It was impossible to get around by car, let alone how you get to those locations. So, along with the emphasis on communication, I agree that the last place you want to be is in a car. Next would be in the train, and the optimal place is to be off the train in a town you weren't planning to be in a hotel, right? So, the question, what I might add to the after action to be really as clear as possible about is how you find out about the track disruption. In other words, in real time. Is there a way, and I don't know the answer to that, when do you know that the track is blocked? And you mentioned earlier in the report that you relied on Norfolk Southern to say that it was open. So at what point and how do they know that, in fact, there's a blockage? That would be one of the first things. And the second is how you get to the location to remove it. And if you could comment on that, is there something that goes on the track to get there? So if you could comment on those two things.
So the second question is a little harder because the diversity of the locations is really significant. There are some places that are readily accessible by roads. There are some places that along the right-of-way, there are access roads that heavy trucks can go along, and there are other places that you can only get to if you high rail there, which is, you know, have a high rail vehicle that actually goes on the track. So depending on where you are, there are different accessibility situations, and that's something that we rely on the host railroads to deal with. Your first question, though, the host railroads, Norfolk Southern, CSX, they constantly monitor the conditions of the railroad, and they know when it's blocked. As soon as they know, they let Amtrak know, and Amtrak, to their credit, specifically in this, was in virtually constant communication with us on how the railroad was operating. As we talked about earlier, Sunday night, CSX in some parts was already saying, we're not going to run trains here because it's too much of a risk. And as we found out from Norfolk Southern, Amtrak found out first, and then we found out, so we knew where the trains were and where things were accessible. What we don't know, and what's difficult to know, is whether there's one tree down or whether there are dozens of trees down. And that, you only find out when the crews get out actually on the right-of-way, which is very difficult.
So that's kind of my question. It's not that there are cameras monitoring this or sensing that something fell on the track. How do they actually know? Visually? Somebody has to see it?
For the most part, that's the way it is. I mean, there are some parts of the right-of-way that have cameras. Amtrak, for example, between Washington and Boston, has cameras in places, and obviously it's more populated, people can see it. But some of the places in Southwest Virginia and really between Lynchburg and here, there are miles and miles where there's just not a population.
Well, that's why I might just add that to the after action is that if you had real-time information, you know, because we don't know when the train was let out of Lynchburg if there in fact already was a tree over the track. To the degree there's any technological solution to that, it might allow for different decision-making at that moment.
But that's a great point. Quite frequently, you're relying on the person in the cab to see the condition.
Okay, thank you. Good report.
Great. Any other questions? Anybody else on the phone? Oh, great. anything else for your report at this point?
Nope, thank you, I appreciate it.
Great, thank you, DJ. So next, I'm very pleased to introduce Devin Barnhart with Capital Transportation Consulting. She is going to be speaking with us about the federal bill, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which I know you all are very aware of, but we wanted to give you an opportunity to hear some more about the specifics that are in the bill, particularly as it relates to passenger rail funding. So, Devin, welcome.
This on? There we go. Hi, everyone. I'm Devin Barnhart, and this is me without a mask. I am smiling at all of you. I am an infrastructure consultant. Basically, I just help states, MPOs, transit agencies deal with Congress. Just a little bit about my background. I was on the Hill for more than 10 years, focused on rail policy specifically, but also all of surface transportation. Worked on a bunch of the past authorization bills, also the appropriations bills, which is where normally the real money comes from. And really just excited to talk to you all about what was in this bill. One other quick thing, in addition to being a consultant, I'm also the executive director of the One Rail Coalition. This is a coalition of all the associations that work at the federal level on rail. So it's AAR and Amtrak, hello Bruno, the labor groups, engineering, suppliers. It's the whole world of the freight and passenger system. And so at the end of the slide, or at the end of my presentation, I have a couple of slides focused on some polling that we did just this past year, but we also did polling the year before, just to show you some of the sentiment around transit and rail during these times. So next slide, please. Okay, so everyone talks about infrastructure as if it's a lot of things, and it's very confusing in the press, and for those of us who do infrastructure as a job, it's mind-boggling. I'm a civil engineer and a lawyer. I like words to match their meaning, and in this context, they really don't. So I'm just gonna focus us on what specifically we're talking about when we talk about the infrastructure bill. The smaller, sort of greenish circle, that's the infrastructure bill we're gonna focus on today. That bill, they have decided to call it the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. IIJA is a mouthful. We'll just call it bill for short. It is the things that we know and love on infrastructure, right? It's all the surface transportation modes, broadband, resilience. It's the hard infrastructure you think of when you picture the word. There is also another bill they sometimes call infrastructure that is called Build Back Better. It has 15 other titles: reconciliation, family infrastructure, soft infrastructure, social infrastructure. It's a whole host of things, but it's a separate but also important bill that sometimes gets lumped together. So I just flag that bill is out there. It has not passed. It does have infrastructure money that we all might care about in there. There's $10 billion for transit with really broad eligibility and another $10 billion for high-speed rail. Unclear where that bill ends up, but it exists and people will continue to talk about it and sometimes call it infrastructure. But back to the main bill, which is the smaller, albeit not small, infrastructure bill. Can you go to the next slide, please? This bill is actually two bills combined in one. Some may say it's multiple bills combined in one, but for our purposes, it's the policy bill. So every 5 years, we pass a big surface transportation policy bill that sets all the requirements for highway and transit and rail projects, as well as how our MPOs do planning and a host of other things. But that policy bill is important to us because it sets the structure for how we implement all of the new money that's coming. The other side is the shiny side. That is plus-up funding. This is sort of once-in-a-lifetime plus-up, big infrastructure funding. So, but both of these bills are important for our purpose, or both sides of this bill are important for our purposes. Next slide. This is just a picture of what the plus-up money looks like. This is not all of the money in the bill, but this is the new plus-up appropriations money that will be available shortly. And I use that shortly sort of in quotations. It will be coming sometime soon. Just to give you a sense, it's a whole host of things, right? It's resilience money, which can be important for some of the conversation we were just having, grid money, broadband, water, sewer pipes, all that kind of good stuff, ports. And then the bulk of the money is really at the Department of Transportation for our world of programs. Next slide. This is really just to give you a relative sense of how much more money are we talking about in our space. It's sometimes hard to do apples to apples, but this is a pretty close comparison. The current FAST Act, that's our highway and transit bill, that last year was in place. You can see there's a pretty big jump in highways, pretty big jump in transit, huge jump in rail. Some people will see this slide and think, why isn't the rail piece bigger? Why isn't the transit piece bigger? And I hear you. Half of my job is just saying, like, please make that piece bigger. But it is shocking to me, and in the most exciting way, that this piece is as big as it is. I was in this exact piece 3 years ago and never would have imagined that we would have this much money for rail or transit. The fact that they were able to get this passed in a bipartisan way in a very tight Congress, the Senate is 50-50, is unbelievable. So it is in no small part due to Senator Warner, who sat on the bipartisan group. This was a big priority for him to have this rail money in here. And all of the work of sort of the rail advocates and everyone that's been pushing for this for years, Amtrak included. And so this is exciting. For anybody that says otherwise, like, I'll fight you all day. This is a big deal. And so on the next slide, you'll be able to see sort of why it's such a big deal. Can you hit the next slide? Okay, this isn't a DOT slide. So what you can see here is the money that they have been spending on rail since, sorry, small font, 2009. That 2009 money is ARA. That was when we did the stimulus bill. But the blue section in the middle, that's pretty low. That's our normal world of rail funding that goes out the door. It's relatively small. It's mostly for Amtrak. There's some grant money in there that you can sort of barely see starting in 2016, 2017. And then now you look at the far end from the red box on, that's the rail money that's new in this bill. A big chunk of that is for Amtrak, and a huge chunk of it is for discretionary grants. Discretionary grants we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about today because I think it's one of the biggest opportunities for you all who have done so much work to be at this exact moment in time ready to move on to apply to some of these grants. And then also about how important some of this Amtrak money is. But in addition, there's still work that can be done, and there's still sort of more money we can access in the future. So I'll talk about all of those pieces. So next slide. Okay, one big thing to know about this bill is that there is an intense amount of new grant programs. They're across all modes, so highways, transit, there's multimodal programs, there's rail programs. But normally the way that DOT money, I have a slide I'll show you in a little bit, DOT money normally just flows out through formulas and it's set by metrics. Now they have a bunch of new grants. And so if you just look at this screen, every one that's in blue is a new grant. The two that are in black, Build/Raise program, and the Infra program, those are the existing programs that we had prior to this bill passing. Now there's a whole host of new programs. I flagged most of these highways and multimodal grants don't apply to, but it is worth flagging on the next slide that there are two key sort of categories that do apply. The mega projects, the Build/Raise continues, and the Infra grant money, those are all have really strong rail eligibilities. They have attempted to fund significant rail projects out of those pots in the past. Mega projects is a new one, so we're sort of gonna have to see how that program comes along, but rail's eligible there as well. And then SMART grants, that's, if anyone was ever involved in Smart City Challenge that happened a number of years ago, this is a grant program to continue that, but to make sort of cities come along, but it could have some good overlap with the work that you all are doing. Okay, next slide. These are the fun ones. Okay, so there is, again, just to point out the difference between the new grants and the old grants. In black are the old grants, the ones we know, Amtrak, NEC, and National Network grants. CRISI, which is rail infrastructure and safety grants that are eligible for both passenger and freight rail systems. And then there's a host of new programs. Oh, I missed CIG, the transit program is also continued. But there's a host of new programs, and what I should have just put in gigantic letters is under the federal-state partnership, that second one, it says $36 billion. That is so much money for rail. That is astronomical increase in rail funding going out the door, and you can almost add up the other programs and still be less than what's going into the Fed-State Partnership Program. So just gonna talk a little bit about the specifics of each of these grants, and then talk about the process for them. So next slide, please. Okay, for CIG, I'm not going to read these all. I hope that you all have access to these slides, but important things to note because you guys have a dual project that has both transit and rail, there's a significant amount of core capacity money that folks will be able to access through this program, so great that CIG is continued. One of the things I talked about earlier is there's a lot of money in this bill, but there's also access to more money through the appropriations process. The appropriations process is the annual funding bill that funds portions of surface transportation. This is one of those programs that could see additional increases as we go through the appropes process each year. And so while it's a significant increase, it is likely to be more depending on how many projects go into that pipeline. And so getting into that pipeline is critically important just because folks, there's a lot of broad support around getting those projects out the door. Okay, next slide. Say partnership. This is the big one. This is $7.2 billion a year. ARA money for rail, if we look back to that big pot, was somewhere around 8. So this is basically that a year. This is another program. So the Fed State Partnership Program is a program that has existed through the FAST Act. It's not exactly new, but they rewrote it significantly enough that it feels like a new program. So I marked it in blue. But of note, this is where you get new service, improved service, expanded service. This is the growth program for passenger rail. It's also, it doesn't say explicitly high-speed rail, but high-speed rail would be eligible under this program. It is going to take a big effort by the department to be able to implement the program and to get all this money out the door and to make sure that folks are in a position to be able to spend the money. And so they're spending an immense amount of time right now sort of thinking through these steps about how this program will work, what will it cover, and how to quickly get people moving on these projects. Next slide. CRISI, I'll go pretty quickly on CRISI. CRISI is an existing program, does a host, it's a big tent program. If you're in the rail space, you're probably eligible under CRISI. One thing to note in this space, there's new eligibility for innovative rail projects. So thinking through some of your challenges on the resilience front with technology, this is a great space to think about. Could CRISI money cover some of this? Next slide. Crossing Elimination Program. This is a big new program. This is a lot of complaints on the highway side come from being stuck, sitting, waiting for trains. A lot of complaints on the passenger side when folks are crossing. And so this is an exciting new program that can allow us to remove some of those crossing challenges. It has a sort of broader scope. It's called Crossing Elimination, but there are some other eligibilities within the scope of the program. But this is brand new, so this is another one that will take a little while to get out the door as they work through the specifics. Next slide. Amtrak. All right, everyone's favorite. Amtrak, the two things to note, they broke up the money between the NEC and the National Network, which is typically how we do it. It's about $1.2 billion on the NEC, and it has some pretty focused language around what they should spend the money on, including dealing with the backlog on the NEC, as well as dealing with some of their service challenges. Next slide. Okay, National Network, very similar in terms of what the eligibilities are, focused on long-distance rolling stock and state-supported rolling stock, importantly. I know everyone's been doing an immense amount of work trying to get new rolling stock procurements finished and funded, and so this is an exciting eligibility. ADA has been, I don't have to tell anyone here how long ADA has been going along and the need to finish that work at stations. Maintenance, and then again, new technology, so opportunities there to think about how can we spend some of that technology money. It's also Amtrak shared services. Sometimes states have flagged challenges with Amtrak on a host of their sort of shared services that everyone accesses, security and other types of funding. Those are all available under this pot of money. So I think it's going to be a really exciting time to talk about how this funding goes out the door, and really exciting to see the changes that come from its implementation. But one thing to flag, this funding isn't Amtrak's base funding that allows for all the operations. That still goes through the normal appropriations process, and so Amtrak will need to have significant continued funding every year. And so for those of you that spend any time talking to anyone in Congress, that's a great opportunity to continue to fund those programs because it is very necessary despite these big increases that we see. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about how the money works. Discretionary grants are amazing because it gives lots of people an opportunity to push projects that haven't traditionally had access to transportation funding at the federal level before. It also comes with sort of a world of hurt, which is that everyone is going to be applying for everything, and there are so many new programs, and each of these programs takes an immense amount of effort to put out the NOFO and the regulations around the program, get applications, write applications, receive and review applications, and then the whole process of actually implementing a project. So while this is amazing, it is like sort of jarring for those of us who see how much grant money is about to be flowing. It's gonna be a hard process for everyone. And so one of the really important things to do is really to start now to identify the key grants where you may be eligible. Virginia is a shining star in the rail space, and it's that the hard work that you all have done to get here is incredible, and so there's a big opportunity to benefit from some of these grant programs. But, you know, you might be asking, like, which ones should we target and which ones are best for us? And so the best thing that everyone can do is to start thinking about which pots do you fit into, where do you look most competitively attractive, and then start having conversations with FRA right away. No one should wait to have those conversations because they're thinking through these same challenges. They want to pick projects that are moving forward and are able to move forward. The fact that you guys work so closely with the freight railroads sets you apart from many other projects that don't have that sort of hand-in-hand state, local agency, freights, Amtrak. It's sort of a unique situation that you all are in, so I think it's a real opportunity. I'll just flag real quickly on the next slide. This is how the bulk of the money goes out the door. For the states, it's very easy. It flows pretty seamlessly. The money goes out without a lot of hassle. There are some challenges that might delay some of the funding around the appropriations bill, but just generally speaking, the formula funding for this bill, states are going to have access to that pretty quickly. So whenever you're working with the state on the project, their state funding should be available more quickly. On the next slide, you will see, this is a Devin Barnhart potential estimated timeline. This is not, no one else signed off on this. But just to give you a sense of how we've looked at grants in the past, formula money, as I was just talking about, the kind that flows right to the states, that can go out pretty quickly. That can start flowing. The existing grants, any grant that has already existed because they had a regulation, because like Build Tiger, we know how to do those, the NOFOs are essentially written, those can move pretty quickly. New priority grants take a little bit longer. They are prepping them, they're moving really quickly on them, so we expect to see those relatively soon. But there is a holdup with approach that does impact some of those programs. So they probably won't be out like in the next couple of months, but hopefully shortly. The last pot of programs, there will be programs that just don't come out right away. They're trying to figure out, can they combine programs to get more of them out quickly, but there will be a slog of projects that just don't happen as quickly. As you're thinking about applying for these grants and thinking through what you're eligible for, it's really important to keep in the department objectives. They will say these sort of at every opportunity. The Biden administration has been extremely focused on these objectives. Safety is obviously the number one, it always is for the department. But these other four are ones to keep hitting home. I should say transformation of our nation's infrastructure is also a pretty typical one, but the equitable economic strength, racial equity and economic inclusion, climate and resilience. These are big picture items this department is very focused on, particularly around equity. The president has an executive order called Justice 40 that the department is implementing their piece of, which is when they're looking at programs, they're trying to make sure that 40% of the benefits go to areas that are economically distressed. And so these can have big impacts on how well you compete. And so thinking through when you're thinking about which grants might we apply for, you really want to focus on sort of where are we hitting on these key department objectives and how are we going to be more competitive within the scope of them. Next slide. Okay, now I'm just going to jump into a quick couple slides on our polling. One Rail did polling. We planned our polling at the beginning of January, right before COVID hit. And so our polling went out, I think, in April that first year, which is made for a real challenge, writing and asking people what they thought about transit and rail at that point. And then we did a follow-up this last year and really saw a host of positive feelings. Folks were very, very interested in rail and passenger as it relates to reducing GHG emissions. This is sort of across the board and across generations. So you can see 83%, it's one of our highest polled numbers. Next slide. This is the one that really surprised us. Last year, this was 6 out of 10 really wanted to come back to rail and transit after the pandemic. This rose to 7 out of 10 this year. There is some disparity amongst ages about who's most excited to come back. We were sort of surprised to see some of the younger folks were less inclined. They were more focused on Uber and Lyft and those kinds of services. But still a really strong number of folks who are very interested. So as we're thinking about planning our rail and transit into the future, we know that it's going to be important to a variety of Americans. Next slide. And then just the last one, this is 1 out of 2 believe that we should be investing more in public transit and passenger rail. This number, can go either way. It's great that 50% of Americans think that we should be doing that. It's also great that we're about to, but it means that we really have a task in front of us of showing what that investment can do. So we'll sort of be watching this number over the years to sort of see how people are feeling about these big investments that we're making and what those projects mean on the ground. All right, I talked for a very long time. I am happy to answer any questions or talk about any of the slides that I put up, but super excited to brief you all today.
Great, thank you. Any questions for Devin? I will start because I have one actually. Can you talk a little bit about, just from your awareness of some of the other work that's happening in other states, about the type of competition that, as you mentioned before, everybody's going to be applying for everything, but we think we're very well situated, at least, to be able to compete well. But are there other states or other major projects that we will likely be competing with that may be on similar timelines as ours?
I mean, sort of depends on which program you're going through, but as we all know, California has spent an immense amount of time, very similar, trying to get everyone on the same page, has extensive ridership, and this, I'm not speaking specifically about their high-speed rail project, but their passenger service. So I think California is very much eyeing this funding. But really, this is the most excitement we've seen from across the country. So there's a lot of interest. People did a ton of planning work around the ARA money, and then the ARA money was gone. So I think many parts of the country are just picking that piece up. So while I think a lot of folks are interested, I think few are sort of in the space where you guys are, where you have spent all this time prepping and having a very clear vision for what you're building. So I think it is somewhat limited in that sense, the competition. I will say there are projects in Illinois and other places that have been trying to access funding. We've also just seen a really big push from some states that we don't normally, Montana, and other folks talking about having new service. And I think folks are really excited about what it might mean to have a new map of where expanded service could go. All of that takes time. And so I just keep pushing people to be like, yes, we should do this big aspirational thinking where it makes sense, but we also should be focused on really getting shovels in the ground where we can, and this is clearly a spot where they could do that.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? Does anybody on the phone have any questions?
Chair, I had one quick question.
Sure, Rod.
Ms. Barnhart, good to see you.
Hi, how are you?
I am good, I am good. I want you to know your comment about the appropriation stuff, where the real money comes from. As a former authorizing staffer, I was a little bit
I'm
disappointed.
also an authorizing staffer.
No,
but
I
you
know. I was a little disappointed to hear the gusto behind where the real money comes from, quote unquote. But anyway.
The cash in hand, Rod.
I know. Good to see you. Good to see you. Authorizing staff still matter. The four broad, not broad, but the four stated objectives in your slide, I thought were particularly noteworthy. particularly the piece about safety, obviously, but also about equity. The equity piece seems to be a very big focal point for this administration. And dealing with another mode with one of your former Senate Commerce colleagues who's now over at the FAA, they seem to be leaning very forward into the equity inclusion piece. How much of a differentiator do you think that'll be with respect to successful applicants?
They're writing it into every application already. So in the NOFOs that have gone out on Lono, maybe Chrissy, I'd have to go back and look. They've started writing equity analysis and encouraging an equity analysis as part of all the projects. Do I think it's going to be determinative of every project? No, but it is a priority focus. They have a team that's been working on how do we assess this at the department? What does it mean to have those benefits? So they are spending an immense amount of time, and they want to see results in that space, so I think it's going to be a huge priority. Rail, we haven't had, transit is pretty, like an extensive history of talking about equity. We don't talk about that as much in the passenger rail space, and so thinking through what that means in the passenger space, I think is an important component, and ensuring that people have access to intercity travel. It's limited everywhere with aviation losing lines, bus services closing down in some spots. Amtrak is one of the only intercity options they have. And so really thinking through what does this mean for folks in terms of long distance travel is critically important.
Thank you.
I have a question. Yeah, sure. It was a good presentation. I appreciate it. The one slide I found a little difficult was 18, the potential timeline.
Yeah.
I didn't really, there are no dates in there. It's a little hard to figure
Yeah.
out what you mean, and maybe it's because it's so amorphous. But my big issue is, what are we doing? I mean, what's most important about all this is the opportunity for VPRA. And so what is your plan, and what do you see doing in the short term and then as it unfolds?
So we are already in I know Sparnhart referred to the CIG grants, the capital investment grants that are actually transit grants. We are already in that pipeline. We submitted that back in August and have been accepted by FTA into the pipeline. So it's a very competitive grant program with transit projects competing from all over the country, and it's a multi-year process, so at least a 2-year process to get through, sometimes longer than that. We've had some projects in Virginia that may have taken 7 years to get through that process, but we are in that pipeline now, so that is that's one area where we do expect to compete, and I think compete very well. We've been talking, I know, quite a bit about having a really holistic sort of grant strategy, rather than just trying to apply for everything that's out there all the time, but really trying to put together a federal funding strategy that we could then bring to DOT and talk with them about, here's the type of level of participation that we hope to see from federal grants in this, and these are the types of programs that we would expect to go after, but also to get some feedback from them on that too. And they've really encouraged us and welcomed that. I know I've spoken with the FRA administrator about it, and they're ready for us to come in with that kind of strategy. They are, as Devin mentioned, they're looking for feedback as well from the states and the potential applicants. They really want, as they are struggling to put together this program, they are very interested in hearing from all of us about project development timelines, things that sort of how we see things going on our end, but we are, I think, pretty far ahead of a lot of other states because I can't emphasize enough the importance of the arrangements that we've already negotiated with Norfolk Southern and with CSX. Many of the, Amtrak I know has some pretty big plans as well with lines all over the map, but in many cases they don't have host railroad agreements already for those, and so that will, I think, help us quite a bit as well. So.
We'll say when I give this presentation to anyone that isn't you all, the 4th and 5th slides are your project and then the partners in your project, because it's so rare to have that lineup of partners holding hands and having already secured a deal. It is pretty unique, and when I say pretty, it is just unique. One thing on the timelines, like you and me both, I wish there were dates. One thing to think about for grants is, in the past, the way the department has done it is they've put up NOFOs sort of when they wanted to, and they made decisions when they wanted to, and it didn't really have a rhyme or reason. It wasn't like it was happening every March, a certain grant was coming out. So that's been a real challenge with the existing grants. Now that they have dozens of grants that they have to put out the door, encouraging the department to have a transparent process for folks is really important. It costs a lot of money to apply to these grants, and a lot of work to get them to good shape. So yes, it would be great to have some dates around those. The only good news is, not the only good news, part of the good news is there's multiple years of this grant. All of these grants happen over the course of the next 5 years. There'll be multiple cycles. And so just thinking through, maybe this isn't a project that happens in the next, maybe we're not ready to apply in the next 6 months. Maybe we're gonna work with the department and apply next year.
Sure.
The one caveat to think through, which I did not put in these slides, but is always ever present, and as many of you worked in DC know, politics is a thing. The House is likely to flip to Republicans. The Senate is up in the air, but leaning Republican potentially. The administration has a few years left, but that we will be in cycle there too. And so thinking through which projects are important to this administration and this Congress is important to do on the front end as well, and to add that lens to how you prepare your grant applications.
Well, Madam Chair, I would just say, based on what you said, and we've certainly teed it up so well with the branding, the VDOT, all of our partners, VDOT, top of the list, and DRPT, and the vision. So I would think a strategic, plan for federal funding would be a good thing. And I say that partly because we have a new administration here and a new VDOT leadership coming in, so that packaging it and making sure we continue moving forward and being as clear as possible about that strategy, I think can only help. So it sounds like a good idea.
Yeah, and I can say as well that I had a conversation with the incoming governor's chief of staff, and they are putting together a task force of people. I'm not quite sure who's going to be on that task force, but specifically designed to look at funding opportunities under this bill, and to
So-
figure out how Virginia across the board can compete for federal grants. So,
Could be a good thing, yeah.
any other questions? I don't know, DJ, if you had anything to add about federal grants or.
I just want to add to that, we're going to be very aggressive. I mean, we see this as a fantastic opportunity, as I think the whole board knows. We're acquiring railroads, and some of them are in better shape than others. But to the extent that we can use this federal money as an opportunity to increase our safety, whether they're old bridges or tunnels, we are going to be very proactive in doing that. Everything from ADA stations to, again, bridge safety, we're looking for opportunities to move some of those phase 3 and 4 projects forward so we can address this quickly.
One other question I had, was there anything related to the federal match rate associated with CIG grants that, and again, the CIG grant is the grant that we're in the pipeline for, that typically FTA, I think, is typically gives in the neighborhood of about a 30% to 40% federal match, but I don't know if there's anything in the bill that changed that.
It's entirely possible. I will say it's 2,000 plus page bill, but NCIAG grants is not where I spend the most of my time, but I can definitely look and get back to you, but
Okay.
not that I know of offhand.
I'm sorry, I got something else to add. Is there any way to partner with another state that gives you a benefit, like Tennessee or North Carolina?
You should mention that. We actually, we are partnering with North Carolina DOT on a grant application right now. It's related to advancing planning on the S line, which is the line between Petersburg, that we own from Petersburg to Ridgeway, North Carolina, and NCDOT is working with CSX on the portion that extends to Raleigh right now. We have had some conversations, I see Emily Stock in the room here, with our counterparts in Tennessee as well about potentially looking at rail service through Bristol. There's a lot of interest in the state potentially to expand passenger rail to Bristol. Emily will be talking in a little bit about the General Assembly study that we did. However, it really would make sense to have it be part of a more long-distance line that connects into other destinations south, rather than just going from Bristol north. So we are in conversations with them too. But I think especially the opportunities with North Carolina are going to be significant.
I just know that kind of partnership just usually really is appealing
Yep,
when you
absolutely.
can go beyond your borders.
It
Thanks.
traditionally has been a selling point for grants that have been selected in ARA. You'll remember some of the biggest grants were sort of multi-state freight capacity that was added. They can be really compelling because you get so many political supporters, can add a real like sort of heavy weight to the application process. That being said, it doesn't always make sense for your individual project, so it's really aligning your immediate goals, your long-term goals with the metrics and what makes you most competitive, but it is one of those things that can make you competitive.
Any other questions? Oh, great. Well, Ms. Barnhart, thank you. Good to see
luck.
you.
I'm looking forward to seeing it, and I will be riding, so thanks.
Great. Thanks. Okay, so just doing a time check. So our next item on the agenda is actually our FY22 budget amendment, as well as presentation on the FY23 budget. I want to thank the other members of the Finance Committee that were present this morning. We actually had the opportunity to get this presentation as well. As we noted, we were originally planning to do our Finance Committee meeting in December, but then we knew the governor's budget would be coming out in mid-December with new revenue information. Then we were planning to have our Finance Committee meeting last week, but with the snow, we had to cancel it, and so we were able to meet this morning, and Steve and Shannon are going to go through both the components of the amended budget as well as the FY23 budget. So, Steve?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So before I jump in, I just do want to say that there was a lot of work that went into these two budgets. Shannon did a lot of work. It was very helpful to me, but then also the whole department. This wasn't just Shannon and I doing this work. It involved the whole department. And the point of the amendment and obviously a budget is, one, to provide y'all good feedback on the progress that we're making within the agency on the efforts that you've told us to go forth with. So I just wanted to say that before I jump into the slides. So next slide, please. So this slide, I'm not going to read all that. It's really just here for y'all's information. It basically says, if you're wondering why we're here in early January looking at our budget and not later a couple of months from now, but essentially we have to prepare a budget and present that budget to the Commonwealth Transportation Board, who is a big funding partner towards a lot of the projects that we are carrying out. So by February 1 of each year, we have to recommend a budget forward to them, and that's why we're here today. Next slide. This slide is really just an overview of the purpose of the budget. Not going to read that again, but the classifications, I do want to talk for a moment about those, because as you're looking through the budget document, you'll see that it's compartmentalized into three separate areas. One is our operations budget, which is our general administrative cost, but more importantly, the cost to actually run the passenger service, which is the core of the purpose of our authority. The second classification is capital projects, and on capital projects, the key differentiator here is, it's sort of on a financial accounting perspective, is projects that are our projects, and at the end of the day, we will own the underlying asset related to the project, and going forward, we'll have to maintain those assets. And then finally, the third sort of section of the budget is our capital and operating grants, and this is where we have an outside partner that's going to carry out the work, and they're going to do that work on assets that they will own at the end of the project. Next slide, please. I didn't say this, but at any point, please feel free, if you have questions as we're talking. We're both comfortable with the questions as we're moving forward. So before I let Shannon take over and take you through capital projects and the capital and operating grants sections of these budgets. I just want to give a real high level of what we're doing. We are looking to amend the FY22 budget, which is the year we're in currently, and it's not something that will be a commonplace event. It's a one-time event for us for three real reasons in my mind. One, Western Rail Initiative, we had briefed y'all on that back last spring, but because we did not know for certain that the deal with NS was going to push through, was not incorporated into the budget at that time. So the approved FY22 budget does not have that large initiative, which in the next 2 to 3 months we will need to make significant expenditure for. Next item is we did, in working through our financial statement audit, we reported our operations, our revenues, and our expenditures on a gross methodology, meaning we showed both of them, whereas before when we did the budget last December, we kind of mirrored what DRPT had been doing for years, which was just utilizing the net expenditure amount. And I do think it's very important for this new classification at a gross level because it does show a lot better information with respect to those core operations. And then the third thing I wanted to point out here is you're looking through these slides and Shannon's talking you through the capital projects and the capital grants. Yeah, I think we tried to make these slides point out to y'all where we had new projects. So anything new where you're authorizing new funding, you're adding funding to an existing project, but then also the third thing was wherever there was a project and for whatever reason we may have removed the project or the project budget has decreased. And those, as opposed to focusing on 1 year of expenditure on these capital items, I'm trying to tee up to focus on the total capital budget and the total capital grant budget. And I think those three items would be important. So in looking at that, when compare the FY22 budget amendment and then we move to the FY23 proposed budget that will be hopefully recommended forward to the CTB when we meet again at the end of or beginning of February. I think the only thing you got to focus on is the total capital projects, the total capital grants budget are the same in both documents. All we're doing, and it's why there's this red box, all we're doing for 23 is we're showing another year of expenditure. So we're showing the FY28 year of timing of expense is the only change between the two. With that, I am gonna, if you have any questions for me, otherwise I'm gonna hand it over to Shannon to take you through the first couple of sections.
Alrighty, let's go ahead and jump in. We're going to be starting with capital projects here. And as Steve mentioned, we're trying to create the budget so it really mirrors a financial statement. So capital projects are going to eventually end up on the balance sheet as fixed assets. So these are going to be assets that we own at the end of the completion, and we're going to be tasked with doing the maintenance on them for their useful lives. So that's really what's defining a capital project in this section. There's two key programs within the capital project section, and we're going to kick ourselves off with the I-95 corridor program on the next slide here. So here you'll see the total changes that we're going to have between the approved and the amended budget. This total budget, as Steve has mentioned, is going to be the same for both the FY22 amendment and the 23 budget. It's going to include all project expenditures for all years. And we're going to talk through these a little bit more in detail down below, but we really just wanted to drive home that it's going to be the same total budget for each of these when we're talking about both the the amended and the FY23 budget. So let's go ahead and press on. So we're going to dive into each of the changes here. So the first call out here is in green. So all of these projects, these 4 projects, the costs here have been updated to align with the executed CRA that was signed with CSX. We'll dive into them a little bit. So Long Bridge, The planned construction for this was really designed to ramp up in 25 and 26 in the approved budget, but now that's shifted out to 28 and 29. The increase you'll see here is related to the time value of money with that shifting out of that project. Next is the Alexandria Fort Track, and this increase relates to additional right-of-way that will need to be acquired for this project. Franconia to Lorton, and then the Franconia to Springfield bypass. The shift here is just a delineation of each of the projects, so there's actually been some cost shifted over to the Franconia to Lorton project. However, between the two, there's a net great decrease of $54 million, so a net positive there. So all of these have just been updated to align with what's in the CRA because that's the budget we'll be managing to on a going forward basis. Next, in the red call out here, we've got the TRV right-of-way transaction costs. So as you know, we've been incurring these since the transaction's really been going on. We're going to put them in the budget now so we can manage towards them. So there's a lot of costs that we were not really aware of in the onset when the budget was presented last year. So we have titling, legal assistance, and survey work that's been going on. So at this point, we'd like to put it in the budget so we can continue to track it. The last item on this page relates to the gross up of the Newington and Route 1 bridges. So in the initial budget, we just included the VPRA portion of this. So there's actually an additional amount that was coming from funding partners. As we're going to be capitalizing the whole total project cost, we'd like to put the total project cost in the budget. We've also included the revenue sources for this as well. So really these increases are just a gross up of the budget with a minor increase in the Route 1 bridge budget. On the next page, we'll continue on to talk about the remaining changes that we're going to be putting through in the amendment. So the first item here goes back to that reclassification that we were talking about, trying to put the budget items in the right bucket. So here we have the Amtrak new equipment, which has been moved over to a capital and operating grant. These train sets are going to be purchased when new service comes online, but we aren't going to be retaining these assets. They're just going to be going to Amtrak, they will own it. So it's not really a capital project, it really equates to a grant. So it's been reclassified out of this section. Next, we have the Richmond Layover Facility, which is a required project in order to meet the schedule defined in the executed CRA, so it's been included in the budget as well. Lorton to Route 1, so this would really be a Phase 3 or Phase 4 project, but when thinking about the corridor, so when you go from Franconia to Lorton, it's 3 tracks, and then this Lorton to Route 1 is this 1.2 miles that drops down to 2 tracks. And then at the Route 1 bridge, it goes back up to 4. So you have this bottleneck that's existing. So what we've decided is, since we have the funding available, we are going to push this project into Phase 1 and Phase 2 in order to have corridor development efficiencies and long-term cost savings, because we'll be able to do the whole stretch in one pass. And then the last section here, the other I-95 corridor projects, this is what Jennifer was talking about. So this is the FTA Core Capacity Grant that we have an application in for. There's some additional costs related to both Long Bridge and Alexandria Fort Track that we're going to need to incur to further that eligibility, so we've included that in the budget as well as a separate cost, so we are able to track that a little bit differently. Before I move off of the total I-95 corridor budget, can I answer any questions on these changes?
Any questions from anybody on the phone? Okay.
Perfect. We'll move on to the other big corridors. So we've got the Western Rail Corridor that we'll be adding into the FY22 amendment on the next slide here. There we go. Awesome. So these are the capital project section of the Western Rail Corridor. There's also capital grants. If you go to page 7 of your FY23 budget, you'll see an inclusive list of what the total Western Rail Corridor looks like. This is just going to be the capital project section of it. So again, the amended 22 is the same as 23, including all project expenditures for all years. So we've got the right-of-way acquisition, the new platform and track that will need to be put in place, and then some condition items that are capital improvements that we've determined that we need to do on the line. And then we've learned that we need to include transaction costs, so that's been included as well. So anything else that I know there's going to be further discussion on this later, so I'm happy to answer any questions on this now, or we can proceed in the presentation.
Question. For the New River Valley platform and track, are there also costs for other infrastructure, parking, facilities?
Right, so the V-Line tunnels, capital improvement bridges, and capital improvements other, it's all capital improvements that are going to be required on the Virginia line that we're purchasing. So due to various survey work that we've done, we've realized that there's going to be some initial infrastructure needs that are going to be required once we purchase the asset. And if you have more specifics, Mike is behind me ready to jump in as well. He can answer some of these questions.
So with regard to New River Valley, I do want to state that we're undergoing a NEPA evaluation. We have 4 sites currently under evaluation. Some of those, I think I heard you mention parking. I couldn't hear perfectly back there.
Yes, parking.
One of the locations at the New River Valley Mall would have parking pretty much already there because there's the mall parking. It's an idea of one way to reinvent the mall. We'd have to work with the mall to make sure there's still adequate parking for the customers at the mall. So that there would be less parking and road needs at that location. However, some of the other locations would need more parking and road needs. So there's 4 alternatives. Happy to, we'll send out to the board a survey we have going on for the New River Valley. We've already received 2,500 comments as of this morning from the public and other stakeholders. So that number is a placeholder for now until we determine the exact site. That is based on one of the options though, and we'll be further refining that as we move forward. I'd rather have that option be whittled down, if you will, budgetary wise and otherwise. But that is a number that we've gotten preliminarily from our consultants. We're going to continue to refine that as the projects move forward.
Thank
Just
you.
For the avoidance of doubt, we're in the middle of a feasibility study that's looking at the 4 different locations that Mike talked about. We're also doing a public survey where we're getting comments from the public. Sometime in the February calendar, we'll be having a public meeting to go over what we found and to get additional comment. We probably will not have a final recommendation on station location. Well, we definitely won't until after February. At that point, when we decide which station, when we have all of those facts in line, when we make the recommendation on which station location we'll go with, we'll know whether money goes to parking or to roads or to environmental work. There's a lot of drainage issues that come with the station, so it's more info to come, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Sorry to belabor this point, but the one thing that we also expect that there will be a local contribution towards the funding station, or towards the funding for the station in the New River Valley. There is a New River Valley Passenger Station Authority that was created in the last General Assembly session. They are made up of all of the local governments in that area, but they are expecting, and they know that we will be looking for and working with them on a local contribution.
Thank you for raising that. That's an important point. At 3 of the 4 locations, there's a trail that runs alongside all the locations. It's a very popular trail that connects Blacksburg and Christiansburg. And we're not harming the trail. We might have to work with it to fit the station and some of the track in. That's a very important point. It's also a pedestrian overpass to it's a neighborhood that is growing to the west of the New River Valley Mall that we want to make sure that people don't have to drive a mile to where the crow flies 400 yards. So that's very important. Station access to us, not just by car, but by bike, walking is very, very important to us. So that is part of the survey and feasibility component to make sure that that is included. But also New River Valley has asked that if we build a station, the station be built in coordination with them because they want to put some offices there. We think it's a great opportunity to have some placemaking, if you will, to allow for, when you're building something new, allow for the New River Valley or the area to have some place to have public meetings, and or New River Valley Station Authority would like to have their offices there at the New River Valley Station, which would make a lot of sense. So,
Great.
Thank you.
Excuse me, does that choice come to the board to decide? Or
The
no?
choice comes to the board. We'll be working with the board. We're all of us work with the Federal Railroad Administration as part of the federal NEPA action. We'll continue to keep you informed.
That's my
But the
question. I
board,
don't know the
obviously,
answer
with
to it.
regard to the budget process, Director Fasette, will.
I think that's something we'll have to look into. I know when we have had, Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think the CTB tends to approve locally preferred alternatives for the NEPA process when we do that. I know there have been times with DC to RVA, we actually did bring the record of decision to the board because we wanted CTB approval on that. But I don't know, Michael, if you had seen other practice at VDOT.
So that's a really good question. For sure, any contract that would be let would have to come to the board, but you're asking specifically about site location? As I sit here today, I can say I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I mean, it might be good to know if the decision, if it's a recommendation of staff to the board, or if it's not, or we're just being informed, to ask questions about it, I don't know.
I will point out that the decision will not be made without the full understanding of the board. I mean, we'll bring all of the data on all 4 locations to the board. It may be an outcome where there's one that is clearly the right
Right,
path.
right.
But a lot of it depends on the locality and
Yeah.
what funding comes. You know, Christiansburg, for example, may be willing to fund a significant amount if the station's at the mall and nothing if it's at the Essex location. So
That's helpful, and it'll be helpful to know who ultimately is responsible, because some of those questions, things that funnel up through the public comment, the access to the station that you were referring to are all interesting things that I think we, at a minimum, have an ability to follow up on.
I also think that the public, if there's a station location that they want that doesn't come to fruition, they'll be reaching out to everybody around this table saying, hey, why not this one? So that you won't be left in the dark.
We're not inviting that. Thank you.
Okay, well, that's going to round us out on the total capital project budget, but now we're going to kind of zoom in and look at the actual annual expenditures here. So we're going to look at this from two different lenses. The first one is we're going to compare the amended 22 budget to the 23 budget for annual spend. So you'll notice here that there's actually going to be a $27 million decrease year over year. Don't worry, the projects are still ramping up. The main driver of this decrease is that we're acquiring more right-of-way acquisitions in FY22, which are not occurring in FY23, causing that decrease. We do expect a large ramp-up of about $73 million in the I-95 corridor projects and $29 million in the Western Rail corridor projects. The lower half of the slide, you're going to see a comparison between the amended FY22 budget annual expenditures versus the approved FY22 budget annual expenditures. What we'd like to call out here is you can really see that shift out of Long Bridge. So that initial construction occurring in 25 and 26, you can see in that blue, has now shifted out to about 27. If you continued it on, you'd see that ramp up there. So that's just the annual expenditure comparison. Last slide in this section, we are going to talk about how all these capital projects are going to be funded. So if we go to the next slide here. So how are we going to fund this $4.1 billion budget? So the big funding sources here, we've got the I-66 inside the Beltway toll funding, VPRA revenues, Amtrak capital contribution, and the CTB allocated. So CTB allocated, this is going to be sources such as PTF, Smart Scale, CMAQ, and then I-81 revenues. This number has increased by about $155 million based on allocated funds specifically for the Western Rail Corridor, which have been incorporated into the budget. The other item here that we'd like to talk about is the I-66 inside the Beltway toll funding. So this revenue source in total has decreased about $270 million. The reason for that is the last study that really kind of forecasted the revenues was done in 2019, pre-pandemic. So now we're working with actuals at this current time. And obviously, well, some of the traffic patterns have returned. The time frame of the traffic patterns is not creating the revenues it once did for that corridor. So we have taken a haircut on this based on our best available data, knowing that there's a lot of uncertainty that goes with this. So is it that we're going to have another variant that comes out and continues to push everybody home? Will federal workers be required to go back to work? Or are they going to work from home? So we just don't really know what's going to happen with this funding source. So we wanted to take a conservative approach, put this align it with the estimates, and go ahead and see where we stood as a total funding picture. Luckily, with this, the VPRA revenues have had an uptick, so we've been able to fill that shortfall with those revenues there. The last thing I want to point out before we move off this slide is there's going to be 3 different financing that are going to happen in order to fund these projects. So like I just mentioned, the I-66 inside the Beltway toll funding, that's going to be led by VDOT and the CTB. And then we have the VRE CROC funding, which is going to happen in the next quarter or so, and that's going to be led by VRE. And then we have our financing on the passenger ticket revenues, and that's going to happen with us, VPRA led, in about 2025. That's going to round us out for the capital projects budgets. I'm happy to pause and answer any questions before we move on.
Questions? Anybody on the phone? Okay, keep going.
Capital and operating grants. So going back to our financial statement comparison, so capital and operating grants are going to hit the income statement. However, they're not part of our core operations, so it would just be another expense. The key differentiator here is that we're going to be giving money to a third party to either improve their capital assets or operate some sort of railroad function, but we aren't going to be we're not the ones that are actually performing those projects. So we're kind of just the pass-through for these funds. We're administering the funds. So if we go to the next slide here, you'll see we've got a total of 29 grants that we are going to be administering. 24 of them are done by the VPRA staff, and 5 of them will be done by DRPT. And we'll talk about the differentiator there in a second, but some of the key drivers for the changes in the funding for grants is going to be changes in grantee project scope, CTB grant awards, budget reclassifications like we talked about before, new or removed VPRA grants, or updated project costs related to VPRA grants. The big change you're going to see here is that we've got VPRA grant funding, so not total project funding. So if you were to go look at Crystal City Platform and VRE's budget, it's obviously going to be more than $700,000. We are contributing a portion of that, so that's what we're demonstrating here is the change in our portion. What are we administering? And that's what we're going to be looking at as far as the change between the approved and then the amended budgets. Last thing to note before we move off the slide is 33% of our grants are going to be CTB allocated, meaning the grantee is going to CTB, putting in their application for what they're going to do, and then the CTB awards it. VPRA was tasked with administering it after the fact, after it's been awarded. So 30% of these are actually being passed on to us from the CTB. You can go to the next slide. So with our new classification of VPRA managed and DRPT managed, you'll kind of see that breakout on this slide here. DRPT managed were not in the budget in the prior year. DRPT has retained 5 grants in accordance with the board-approved MOA. We would like to include them in the current year because the cash flow for these is going to be coming out of VPRA funds. In order for us to better cash manage our investments, we need to know what's going on with the annual expenditures for these. Also, if these projects don't proceed with the grantee, the funding will come back to the VPRA for us to be able to reallocate to our projects. So keeping these in our budget will help us manage these more actively going forward. Before we leave the slide, I want to draw everyone's eye to the total change here of $129 million. We've created a slide that really summarizes this. For 29 grants, it's hard to kind of talk about each one individually, but we're going to kind of put it in like a bigger picture so you can see really what's moving here and what the important changes are. So if we go to the next slide, I'll talk us through that. So starting out here, the top of this table is going to show the new grants or funding changes to the grants. So the first section is VRE scope changes or new CTB grants. So this entire bucket shows that VRE had a decrease of $31 million related to the grants. A lot of this was due to changes in scope. We did the I-95 corridor. They didn't need to do a platform on one side because now they have a railroad there. So a lot of it was just them kind of changing their scope and adjusting to the new corridor that we have going on. And then they have also been awarded a couple new grants as well. That covers off on that first one though, and that's all the VRE changes. The next 4 we would really consider to be VPRA grants. These are our grants being funded with our funds. So we've got the Ettrick Station State of Good Repair, Station Program and Planning, Positive Train Control, and then the S-Line Planning and Development. So Ettrick Station and the Positive Train Control, these have been updated just because we now have better idea what the costs are going to be. Positive Train Control has been completed. We know where that's going to land. Ettrick Station, I will note, we do have a CRISI grant out there, an application to receive funds in order to help us with this cost increase. We don't know if we have it at this point, so it's not been included as a source, but we are seeking funding to assist us with those repairs on that station. Station Program and Planning, the increase there just relates to our continued commitment to work on state of good repair on our stations. The next section that we've called out is the Western Rail Corridor. So these are the 2 new grants that will be going into our budget related to the Western Rail Corridor. So we've got the Western Rail Initiative grant and the Roanoke Yard improvements, both going to Norfolk Southern here. Last, DRPT Manage is added as a new grant. Even though they were existing last year, we're going to put them in the budget this year. Next section, we've got the removed or reclassified. You'll see that Amtrak train equipment probably looks familiar from capital projects, though the number has changed. It was $55 million up in capital projects. It's now coming here as $34 million. Again, we have a much better understanding of how much this is going to cost, and we've moved it to the correct section of the budget. The 2 next grants to Norfolk Southern have been removed as the Western Rail Corridor is going to be taking place and that transaction is going to occur. These capital grants are going to fall off the budget and will no longer be going out the door. And the last item here, we've got our VRE track lease payment related to CSX. So in accordance with the JOMA that was signed with CSX, this payment is actually going to be for maintenance on our corridor, meaning it's more of an operations expense because it's going to be paying for all of the maintenance that we need to do. So it's been reclassified as well to operations. This is going to drop us down to a $129 million change here. Can I answer any questions on the changes? I know this is kind of a lot to bite off. Okay. Wonderful. We can proceed on to the funding for this then. That's great. So on the next slide, you'll see that we have our pie chart of the 30% of CTB allocated grants, and then we have the CTB allocated VPRA. So I want to note that these, again, are funds that the CTB has allocated to VPRA for Western Rail. So we've carved that out as well. You'll see in the table some of the sources for this. So similar to the other CTB allocations, so the grants get CMAQ, there's I-66 outside the Beltway concessions and Smart Scale for CTB allocated grants, and then the CTB allocated monies coming to us relate to the 2020 Appropriations Act, Smart Scale, I-81 Corridor Improvement Program, and then everything else is being funded with VPRA funds. And then to our last slide, so that we are mirroring capital projects as well. So here's the comparison between the amended and the approved annual expenditures. You're really gonna see, pretty much everything is gonna be very consistent. 23 had a really big uptick. A big driver of this is the $26 million payment that's going out the door related to the Western Rail Initiative grant. And then also when we sourced all of the cash flow expenditure forecasts from our grantees, they expect a big year in 23. So a lot of this is coming from the grantees and their expected expenditures in FY23. So that is going to round us out for capital and operating grants. Can I answer any questions on this section before we, Jay?
Oh, yeah, I have a question. I noticed in several of the slides there is money in here from the inside the Beltway tolling, which I was involved with at the time. I see money from the outside the Beltway 66. This is all about 66 tolling. What about I-95 tolling?
We, so as you know, there's, on the Hot Lanes project, there is funding that's going to NVTC for transit improvements. We are not, at this point in time, planning to tap into any of those funds. I know VRE is also eligible for those as well, but primarily right now, those funds are being used for commuter bus in-transit improvements.
Okay, so we're not precluded at any point in the future from tapping into it, but at the moment, there are other priorities that those tolling revenues are being allocated to.
They're being allocated by NVTC today. We do have funding in here from the Fredericksburg extension of the Hot Lanes. There was a concession payment that was made by Transurban to the state and for transportation purposes in the corridor. So we are planning to use, forget how much, is it 200 million from that, Steve? 255. What's that? 255. 255. That is generated by the Fredericksburg extension of the Hot Lanes.
I don't actually remember, but the 95 tolling, is that an ongoing percentage or was that a one-time payment?
For the, well, there's different components of the 95, but there's, it is an ongoing payment. For the 395, 95, 395 inside the Beltway portion is a recurring transit payment from the concessionaire. The money that is related to the Fredericksburg extension is a one-time payment. So I don't, Michael knows.
Got it.
These.
You said it perfectly.
Okay.
Okay.
I think Steve's going to pick back up and walk through operations now.
So, next slide, please. Take a few minutes and take y'all through the operations format. But maybe before I start, I wasn't sure about the time, like as far as a break, Jennifer. I didn't know if...
What I was going to propose is that we continue and go ahead and get through these budget slides and then break for lunch. And then we'll have a few items as well after that.
So on this slide, it's really, I wanted to talk a little bit about budget, the two different budgets you're going to be looking at. And the main thing, and I mentioned this earlier, one of the big drivers for doing an amendment was we wanted to show our operational budget instead of showing it just the net cost that we paid to Amtrak or the net subsidy amount. We wanted to show the actual revenues coming in and then all the different expenditures. And I think as I go through this, you'll see the big reason for that is, one, it gives us a lot better data when we're looking at each of our different trains and our different routes to analyze how each of those are doing. And then two, as Shannon mentioned, in fiscal year 25 or thereabouts, we're looking to take this revenue stream of passenger ticket revenues and actually go out and bond against that to provide funding to do some of our capital projects at that point in time. So obviously we need to show those revenues in our financial records to be able to go out to the open market and issue debt against it. Second thing here is, and Shannon's mentioned this several times, there are several reclasses amongst the three different categories of budgets. Apologize for that. I think we've come up with a good standard this year. I think we talked about this back in September to the board, to the finance committee. I think we now have a good standard, and going forward we won't have those reclasses. I know it makes this presentation a little confusing. And the third item here that what as a board member for y'all to be thinking about as we move forward, we have at the very bottom an overall cost recovery metric. And what this actually is for all of our operational costs, including our general administrative expenses. And I think for now, we want to propose this as a metric as we move forward, but for now, we obviously don't know is, the 51% that the FY23 budget is showing, is that a good number or a bad number? And as DJ pointed out earlier in the Finance Committee meeting, we're going to always strive to do better. I don't think anyone here can reasonably expect that we're going to get close to 100%. And I said this earlier, all of our transportation, roads, airports, transit, etc., they're all subsidized. So we're going to have some subsidy level, but to me, I think we've determined internally that a good metric for y'all to look at our performance on how we're managing our operations is this cost recovery metric. Next slide, please. So first, I want to try to walk y'all through the amended FY22 budget, and I think what I'm trying to do with these two slides is bridge that gap of the old net presentation to the new gross presentation, because I just can't take the FY22 approved budget and put it up against the FY23 or the FY22 amended budget, because FY22 approved was just as net expenditures. So the point of these two charts is to, one, show you the amended budget with all the gross level detail, the revenues, all the detailed expenses. As you see, the new budget comes down in the red box to an $18.1 million planned subsidy amount. And then when we shift back to the chart on the left, you'll see the approved FY22 budget had a $51.2 million net cost. And we're comparing that to our 18.1 in our proposed amended budget. And you see it's a $33 million decrease that we're coming back in our amended budget for FY22. The reasons for that decrease are listed below. We had some new service that we thought was going to start in FY22. We now know it won't. So that's about $8.2 million of the decrease. $10.3 million of the decrease was federal credits that have been applied by Amtrak before the bill ever comes to us, that therefore have reduced the cost. We knew there was federal stimulus funds out there, not stimulus, but relief funds out there. When we did the budget last year, we did not know how they were going to be allocated, so we did not include them. So that's $10.3 million of costs that are being covered by outside funds. In addition, the Richmond service that we had in the budget for the full year, it did not return back to service until late in September. So there's 3 months of costs there. And then finally, the other factor that's playing into the decrease is we were very conservative in our estimate of revenues due to the uncertainty of the pandemic. Before I move on, are there any questions on that?
Questions from anybody on the phone? Okay, keep going, Steve.
So next slide, please. So the FY '22 administrative budget, the approved compared to the amended, you see a $1.47 million increase. And a lot of this increase, not quite half, but maybe a little over a third, is payroll. And that is, when we developed the budget December of 2020, we thought 28 employees. Right now, we believe we'll have 34 employees by the end of the year. So that's part of the cost. Additionally, the other large driver here is professional services, which professional services, as I said earlier in the Finance Committee, when we started, we literally had no infrastructure in this entity at all. We had no general ledger, no process, no procedures. So, and we literally, first day there was 3 employees. So we've needed to rely, while we're ramping up our employment level, we've needed to rely on a little more on some consultant support. And as you've heard earlier, there's a lot of federal money out there, and we're using some of that support to help us with applications for that federal financial assistance. And the third item that's noted here is the ERP system implementation. And there's just a slight increase related to that, and it's also, we've had to ramp up a little quicker because we do have more employees, and so some additional needs for IT because of those employees. Next slide, please. FY '23 budget, it's here, shown here, and here I'm going to compare it to that amended budget. So we're no longer dealing with that gross versus net comparison. So on the right here, you see what we're proposing for the amendment with the $18.1 million additional funding required. And then the '23 budget, we're looking at $60 million, which is a $41.9 million increase. What the key factors in that increase are those 2 trains that we thought were going to start in FY '22. Now they're going to start this summer, so it's FY '23. And if you take our FY '22 budget for the 6 trains that currently exist, the expenditures, you divide it by 6, you come out to about $12.4 million per train, 2 new trains. That's the $25 million. In addition, we have some costs related to the Western Rail Initiative, some access fees and some maintenance costs that are new. Our administrative expenses, 22 to 23, are going to increase, and I'll go into that later. Those federal credits that helped keep costs down in '22, instead of $10.3 million in '22, we only have $4.4 million in '23. So that's it basically in turn increases our costs that we have to cover. Those are the main drivers in the increase from '22 to '23 that we're proposing. And once again, I will ask if there's questions before I move on.
Questions?
All right,
Okay.
next slide. This is to take you through the detail of the administrative budget, and for the most part, it's year over year. There's not a lot of change. I mean, there's two items that have some change to take y'all through. One is our payroll and benefits, and FY '22, we started the year with, it's 4 employees or maybe 5. I just don't remember the start date of 1 employee. So in the budget, we were starting with 4 for '22. When you look at '23, we're planning to start FY '23 with 34 employees. So a very significant change in the number of employees that are going to be on payroll for the full year. There's still a ramp up going from 34 to 45, hopefully by the end of FY '23. So that's what that large change in payroll relates to as we finally move towards getting fully staffed. The other item here I wanted to bring your attention to is the other employee cost. That's really travel expenses, training cost, recruitment cost, which in this environment could be significant, and other administrative costs. And with new employees, these costs tend to increase along with the increase in the number of employees. Next slide, please. This slide, I'm not going to go into real detail, but this is, as I alluded to earlier, we are going to report this to you every month. Once the FY22 amended budget is approved, we will report at this level. And I think the biggest thing here is over time, we're working with Amtrak. Rather than reporting by route, we want to report each individual train because obviously they start at different times where you see 2 trains here or 3 trains even. There are different times associated with those. And so we actually want to break this report down to showing all 8 trains individually. And that cost recovery factor I talked about from an overall operational perspective, we also want to get to where we're applying that here. And not that that's an absolute. I think each train has different different parameters around them, different purposes, but it's to help us assess how well we're doing with the train service. Next slide, please. This slide is, as in the other sections, to show you how we pay for our operations budget, and essentially it's passenger ticket revenues, and I'll just focus on FY23. We're at about 51% cost recovery just from the ticket revenues. Then in the remainder of that difference is the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority, the dedicated funding coming out of the Commonwealth Rail Fund. One more point, I think, too, is after FY23, there will be no further federal credits, at least as of right now. So before I move to the next slide, that really takes us through the 3 sections of the budget, the amendment that we're proposing for FY22, as well as the proposed FY23 budget we need to present to the CTB in February. So before I go on, let's take a moment and field any questions.
Any questions?
This is Maria Zimmerman with a quick question.
Sure.
I'm sorry, did you say with the 51% kind of, I'll call it fare box recovery or from ticket revenues, is that based on kind of what we're currently seeing with COVID, or is that based on the pre-COVID operating?
So, Maria, that number, the $62.7 million is based off of Amtrak's projections for FY22, and they don't provide projections into the future. And what I would say to your question is, I feel that we've been, once again, conservative. I said we were conservative last December because of the pandemic, because of the 2 variants that have come about. It also made us concerned. So we have been conservative in our revenue estimates throughout. I'll leave it that way.
Yeah, but it's definitely post-COVID. It assumes COVID. So
Okay.
And I'm going to add too that we didn't realize, back last December, we didn't know when we got to this past summer, we had no idea we'd be back at 70% of ridership. So then the variants hit September and now here in December. The ridership has held pretty well even though the 2 variants have hit. And I'll say 70% return from a transportation mode perspective. I think we have fared really well. But even then, we have been conservative in those revenue estimates. All right, well, moving on then to the next slide. This is part of the budget we do want to propose. I really should have put board management reserve on this title because we want to propose a reserve for you as the board to manage. And if we have a proposal, we would obviously have to come to you for your approval. But all the capital projects that Shannon spoke to you about, they all have contingency built in at certain levels, which are for known risk and even to some degree, there's unknown risk. This reserve is really for unforeseen items within those capital projects. But just as much, in my mind, this reserve is to allow a funding reserve so if other opportunities present themselves, you would have the ability to move forward versus having to look at your whole budget and potentially eliminate other projects. So that's what we're proposing here to y'all is what we call a board management reserve. We did a lot of financial modeling since September, a lot of new revenue estimates, both up and down with our different revenue sources. And added some cost, as you've seen. That being said, in the modeling we've done, we do have about $50, $55 million available over the next 3 to 4 years within the financial model. And what we are going to recommend as part of the budget action when we get to the FY23 recommendation on February 1 is that $15 million be set aside into this board management reserve. And the last column here, when it says metric, it's not really a performance metric, it's really ideas to think about what is the appropriate level or dollar amount that should be put into the reserve. Is it 10% of the total capital projects budget for the 10 years we're working on? Is it 10% of the annual capital expenditures in a year? And I'm just using 10%. That's really the idea here is for y'all to be thinking about as we move forward, if there are other funds available, what is an amount that's reasonable to have sitting in a reserve? So going forward to the next slide.
If I could, just a comment on the management reserve. And so as you said, capital projects all have their contingency reserves that they're required to have. So this is something different from that. And so it's an opportunity fund or enhancement fund to be used for transportation-related items. So I want to say that this is a really good thing to put into the budget. We should also look at some guidance for how we might allocate it or what sorts of projects we want to have considered. But I think good job including this as part of their budget.
I think we feel a lot better. I know Mike, DJ would say this, with the estimates we're bringing to y'all with the current budget, we feel a lot better about them. We did include level of where we are in that planning process in the budget. If you look at the document, you'll see we kind of rated it 1 through 7 of how far along we are, but we feel a lot better about our estimates at this point. That being said, there are every big $4.1 billion of capital projects. There's going to be some things that come up, but I like the spirit of the opportunities this fund could also present, as opposed to a great idea comes along and we don't have any money to even pursue it. So moving along, this slide really just wanted to show y'all the core VPRA revenues. And main point, Jennifer had mentioned this earlier in Finance Committee. We did, compared to December of last year to this December, there was a significant uptick in the revenue estimates. I think there was a little bit, I'm not the economist for the state, but I think there was a little bit of what we did. There was a little bit of conservatism in estimating revenues because there was so much uncertainty. That being said, the second bullet is really a comparison to the revenues at a different point in time back from, I think it was in May when we got a revenue estimate. If you go back to the December that we did in last year's budget, it's actually $170 $179 million increase in our core revenues. Next slide. These next two slides are really just a summary of everything we talked about. So capital projects, we adjusted the I-95 corridor program to the comprehensive rail agreement, adding in Western Rail Initiative, which is getting ready to kick off here in the next month or two. Then added a slight amount for other capital projects. On the grant side, we added in that DRPT managed grants of $22 million. And on top of that, as far as VPRA managed grants, there's about $168 million related to the Western Rail Initiative. And the last thing I'll say here is there was about $24.6 million, if you added the numbers up that Shannon pointed out earlier, that are new grants in this budget compared to the approved FY22 budget related to ETC and related to station state of good repair. And as Ms. Barnhart was pointing out earlier, I think on the station state of good repair, I think we have a good case on several of those that we're going to go look to see if the feds can maybe supplant of some of the funds that we have allocated. Next slide, please. Operating budget. So FY22 approved, FY22 amendment, $33 million decrease. Trains didn't start, federal credits were applied, more revenue than we thought, and a slight adjustment to admin. FY22 amended, the FY23 proposed. The federal credits aren't as significant. 2 new trains we hope to start this summer, so it'll be a full year of their operations. Then there are additional maintenance costs related to the right-of-way that we now will own. And finally, our administrative budget is going to see a fairly large increase during FY23 as we actually get closer to fully staffed up. Next slide, please. This last slide really is, it really is supposed to tell the story for the FY23 budget. And once again, we need to recommend a budget forward and forward that budget document to CTV by code on February 1st. So I think the plan right now is that we're going to have another board meeting on February 1st, hopefully recommend the budget forward to the Commonwealth Transportation Board. So we're certainly open to any feedback you have on the budget between now and then to work through any of that. Once that's presented to the CTV middle of February, we'll do a presentation for them about the detail. I hope to get CTV to approve the budget earlier this year in April instead of May, then come to you in May for final approval of that FY23 budget. That being said, it's not on this page, but the FY22 budget amendment, we are hopeful to bring a resolution to you today to approve those changes so that we can begin reporting and giving you a lot better information in the current year. And that is the last slide we had.
Okay. Any questions? Anybody on the phone? Okay, thank you. So we do need to take an action on the amended FY22 budget. However, I'd like to do that after lunch. We actually need a physical quorum. We're one person short. I know Ms. Dorsch had to run to take a phone call, but she'll be back after lunch. So what I'd like to do is take that action after lunch. Why don't we plan for to reconvene at, for those of you on the phone, at 1 o'clock. We will have our auditor, who was actually supposed to meet with the Finance Committee this morning but was unable to come. He'll be joining us by phone, I think, just to give a very quick update. We'll have one agenda item after that, and then we will need to go into closed session as well after that. So, but we should still be out of here by 3 o'clock today as planned. So, okay. So why don't we do this when we go ahead and break for lunch? I believe lunch is down the hallway on the right. And then we will reconvene at 1 o'clock. For those of you on the phone, we will be back in a little while, and we'll look forward to rejoining you then. So, thank you. So we are going to go ahead and get started. I know we still have 1 or 2 people out of the room, but Steve is going to lead us off. We actually have our auditor, who was planning to be at our finance committee meeting this morning, was not able to be here in person, but he is on the phone, and he's going to give us a recap of our inaugural VPRA audit. So, Steve, you want to get started?
Introduce Rob Churchman with Cherry Beckert. We had a very good and productive audit working with them this year. Pleased to say there weren't any issues, unqualified opinion. So set a high bar, I guess, going forward. And with that, Rob, I think he has certain required communications as part of the audit process that he wants to relay to y'all. And with that, I'm going to hopefully get him to connect through WebEx.
I think he is. Rob, are you on the phone?
Yes, ma'am, I'm here.
Okay, can you speak up a little bit? It's a little hard to hear you. Oh, there you are. Oh, no,
Sure.
that's Steve.
Is that better?
That's better. Oh, there you are. Okay. Great. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for allowing me to be here at the earlier session. I have en route to see you this morning. I had a positive family household test, so I brought myself back home. But as Steve mentioned, there are certain communications that are required to be provided to those charged with governance at an entity, regardless of whether it's a not-for-profit or international conglomerate and so forth. And I have those ready to be discussed. Were you going to, I sent the slides over, am I going to control the slides from my side, or is you going to bring them up on your side?
I think we have the ability to do them here if you just let them know when, yep, there we go.
Sure.
Just let them know
Okay.
when you need to change slides.
Will do. Next slide, please. I have 4 key areas I need, well, 3 that I have to talk to you about, and the 4th one, the purple one, is sort of just an FYI of what's going to happen, or is happening in the governmental accounting standards area for the next week. For the next years coming forward. Next slide, please. Engagement services, next slide. Now, you may be saying, Rob, what you're going to be telling us, what we're seeing right now, we know we hired you to do an audit. We know we hired you to do this and that. Well, the standards don't presume that those on this call right now, or those present in the audience, had any discussion or knowledge of what our audit contract conveys and so forth. So they require us to go through these items each time, regardless of whether or not, again, I've had clients who've heard me say this 5-6 years in a row because they've stayed on the audit committee or finance committee and so forth. But I still have to say it anyway because, again, the standards require it. We're hired to do an audit of your financial statements as of your first full fiscal year end, 6/30/21. Because of the nature of some of your funding and revenue streams, we're required to do that not only in accordance with generally accepted auditing standards, but also with government auditing standards. And then also, if you had reached enough revenue amounts, expenditures amounts for that were federally related, you would have had to have what we call a uniform guidance audit, which in the old days was just simply called a single audit. They changed the terminology a little bit several years back to kind of make the terminology more global. But in essence, it's a single audit of your federal dollars. And you did not have enough money this year to require that, but it is anticipated you will have enough money from the federal side next year for us to do that audit. And then also, because you're a state authority, the Auditor of Public Accounts of the Commonwealth of Virginia has some specifications that are required by us as auditors to do over authorities, boards, and commissions. Now, for those of you who may have some ties to city or county, they have the same thing, but they're much more, there's much more of them at a city or county level as opposed to authorities, boards, and commissions. But we still have to do it. And there are areas, for example, like cash, some investment steps, some conflict of interest steps, and so forth. And we do those for any authority that is that we're auditing for in the state of Virginia. Next slide, please. Now, the most important slide is the next slide that's going to come up after. Next slide, please. And that's the overall audit results. Our opinion, we read an opinion on the financial statements that was unmodified. That is again, getting back to the global area, that is a global term that has been modified. In the old days, it would be called unqualified. But because of the international auditing standards, they wanted to kind of get the entire world using some similar terminology. We changed it to unmodified. What it means is that we found that your statements are fairly presented in all material respects, and of course, generally accepted accounting principles. It's the audit opinion you want to have from your auditor. It's the best one you can get. And then also, as I mentioned earlier, because of the nature of some of your funding and the fact we had to do a government auditing standards audit also, that's our second bullet there. That's the internal control of financial reporting and compliance. That also is unmodified. Again, the perfect opinion you want to have from your auditor. And then on Virginia compliance, we had no matters to report there either. With regards to compliance with laws and regulations, we don't do an audit that gives you an absolute opinion on all compliance across all borders of your operations, but we are required to give you a report that says if we found anything. And again, as it states here on the screen, we had no matters of non-compliance that we thought needed to be reported to you regarding the material effect on the financial statements, and that includes also debt agreements and so forth. Again, this slide is the perfect slide you want to hear from your auditors, and it's a testament to the finance department's operations and abilities, Mr. Pitter and his crew, in getting this level of opinion in the first year of existence. Next slide, please. Actually, there'll be two more slides. So next one also. Getting into my last required section of discussion, we're going to be talking about some of the required areas that, again, because these are standards that relate to any size, breadth, or depth of entity, not just commercial or governmental or not-for-profit and so forth. These are required to be discussed each time. Now, I will admit, as I have in many other sessions, that some of these items aren't really applicable to you, but because they are required, because they're meant to cover the entire universe of audits, I had to at least let you know that I took them into consideration and/or they weren't applicable. But first, as you see there, accounting policies. If this was an entity that had many years of existence, there could be a chance the policies could change over years. And because you're not there 24/7 and we're not there 24/7, we are required to let you know if we are made aware of any material changes to the accounting and recording of activity. And all your policies, in essence, as it states there, were basically put into place this year. There may be very real possibility that next year I might be reporting to you that there have been some changes in the policy, because as you grow as an entity in your life, there will be times when you might want to change a policy here or there. But in this case, being the first year of existence, all your policies were new. With regards to the financial statements themselves, because no entity can afford to have an audit that audits 100% of every item and is there 24/7, 365. There are some things in accounting where you can't get a solid absolute number for. You have to make an estimate. You can't always have a receipt that you can tie something to, or an invoice you can tie it to. And in your case, you have a couple areas where you have currently you have estimates in place, and then the last bullet here is when you're going to have some going forward. But allowance for doubtful accounts. If you have receivables and there's a possibility, and this is very heavily related to the government arena, cities and counties, for example, for taxes and so forth, you make an estimate of what you're going to collect, because you don't know exactly every dollar you're going to get in. You hope you're going to get it all, obviously. But we look at the allowance for doubtful accounts calculation. We look at your depreciable life for capital assets. You have to make a guess on how long somebody's going to live, and therefore you're going to depreciate it each year. So you look at those lives, and then going forward, you'll have actuarial liabilities that you're going to have estimates of, pensions and other post-employment benefits. So really wasn't the case this year because your newness, your existence coming into play this 1 year. But for all estimates and judgments, we have to look at them to make sure they make sense, to make sure they are, in your case, next year, we'll look at them to make sure they're comparable year over year, to make sure that they are not out of the realm of reason. that you are not recording something, an allowance account at, say, 20% of the receivable when everybody else in the entire plan is at 10, for example. So we do look at how you stack up against your peers and so forth when we're looking at the estimates. We noted nothing in our testing this year that makes us think that any of your estimates are out of the realm of possibility or unreasonable and so forth. And again, next year, like I said, I'll report back to you on whether or not they stay comparable. Now, estimates can change year over year, but making sure that they're the reasonable reason for them changing and not just something where, and again, and this is really relevant to government, but it's also hyper relative to corporations, where they may change an estimate year over year because they want to modify where their bottom line is going to come out. That's why it's important for us to talk to those charged with governance about the estimates that are in place. With regards to the last section here on this slide, we're required, unless they're just obviously trivial, we're required to let you know if we have any changes that we proposed to the general ledger, to the accounting, to the debits and credits, either that we proposed and was made, or proposed and was not made because for various reasons. And generally, it's because they're immaterial to the overall statements. In the case of the authority, we had no uncorrected. When we use the word misstatements, it makes it look ominous, but it's really not ominous. Just the words we have to use. We had no uncorrected misstatements that we asked the finance team to make in order for us to believe that the statements are fairly presented. Again, another example of the opinion you want to have from your auditor on the operations of the audit and the financial statements themselves. Next slide, please. Okay, so this looks very ominous because I have words like disagreements, difficulties on there, so forth. And it's at some clients, I've had this slide be, frankly, 3 or 4 pages long because not every audit is without disagreements, is without difficulties. But I'm required to let you know if I came across any of those in my audit for your authority. And we had no disagreements with management over reporting or presentation of the financial statements and disclosures. And we had no difficulties encountered with working with them and wanting to get information from them, getting proposed changes to the presentation of the financial statements through them and so forth. So again, I sound like a broken record, but it's the opinion you want to have, or report you want to have from your auditor. And then also this last item here on this slide, I'm required to make you aware if there's ever any material communications that you would not have been privy to throughout the audit. That could be a significant matter in a legal letter. That could be other matters. The item that's here is just to make you aware of what this is. The standards require, because I give you 4 pieces of paper that goes into your document, that's your financial statements, the opinion and the GAS report. This letter is required because it wants to document, or the standards require it to happen because to document the responsibilities of management over the financial statements, because they are not our financial statements, they are your financial statements. And so this management representation letter is a standardized letter. It's likely the same across any accounting firm you're looking at because they're all really just straightforward items. And what it represents is from management to us as the auditor that they recognize that that we have done our audit in accordance with the engagement letter, that they are your financial statements, that you provided all records that'll be relevant to me. In a case where maybe you've had a federal or state regulator come in and look at your operations for some reason, that you've given me a copy of that report. So these are standard representations that would have that would cause me as an auditor to have an issue if a client came back and wanted to change them. They're literally that straightforward. And so if I ever had a client come back and say, Rob, I can't represent this to you because X, Y, or Z, then I, as the auditor, have to think, well, why is that true? What am I missing to make sure that I have the complete knowledge of the operations so that I can give a full opinion on the financial statements? In the case of the authority, they did not request any changes to my standard representations. They signed it and provided it back to me as 99.9% of my clients always have. And so, but I'm required to make you aware that that letter exists and was provided to us without any pause through that. The core part of what I have to talk to you about. I mentioned earlier that the standards are for any kind of entity. And this first item here is something that's more relevant or more happens more often in the commercial arena as it does in government. I've never had it in my 35 plus years happen, but if I ever became aware of a client of mine who was asking other audit firms what they would let them report, how they let them report something that maybe is I'll use the word controversial, but maybe something that has some gray area, and we call it in our industry shopping the opinion, where an entity may talk to 3 different firms, and they get the right answer they want from one of the firms. That's who they go with. It's never happened in government for me. It's more of a commercial risk, but I'm required to make you aware if I became aware of any of that discussion, and I'm not aware of any discussion that the finance team has had with other firms about accounting, reporting, and presentation. This is probably as important than anything else on the other two previous slides. In my middle bullet here, independence. I'm required to make you aware that we know no transaction, no personnel in my firm, no activities with the firm or other firms that would cause us to be not independent of you. And why is that important? Well, if I'm not independent, I'm not objective, and my opinion means nothing to you. So we have steps we perform yearly at our clients to make sure that our personnel don't have relationships, whether it be with maybe a finance person at an entity, maybe it's a family member or so forth that works or does business with an entity and so forth. So we take those steps to make sure that we are independent. And I would have to tell you right now, well, I would have to tell you much earlier because I wouldn't have been able to give you an opinion. But I'm telling you now that we're not aware of anything that would have impaired our independence. And then my last matter here is just to make you aware that in your set of financial statements, as you've seen, there's a section up front called the management discussion analysis. And that is required by GASB, the people that set up generally accepted accounting principles, as a tool for you to speak to the reader in, it's intended to be in more lay people terms, less accounting jargon, to kind of tell the reader what happened during the year, what significant activities occurred, maybe you've issued debt, maybe maybe you've started a new pension plan. And so for that's where this gets talked about. We don't give an opinion on it. We're not required to, but we do read it. We do provide guidance, suggestive criticisms, corrections. Hey, have you thought about saying it this way? Hey, have you thought about presenting this and so forth? But we don't give an opinion on it. But we do make sure the numbers tie. Oh, I'm sorry, should use non-accounting terms. Agree from there up to the financial statements and so forth. Those are my required communications under the standards. Next 2 slides, please. Thank you. Just to make you aware that in the year we're sitting in now, fiscal year 22, there are some changes that are coming in the auditing industry, and that these may or may not relate to you, but I wanted to make you aware of them. To the extent you have extensive leases, there are some changes in how those will be reported and recorded going forward, as opposed to how they are now. And then also to the extent that an entity had construction period costs that they were incurring for interest. This is the year where the GASB, who sets GAAP, says stop recording that and don't record it anymore as capitalized interest. Our audit opinion actually changed this year. The AICPA has put out standard changes for hope. Their hope is to make our opinion as an industry easier to understand and provide more insight into what an audit actually does and what can be inferred from a audit opinion as with regards to the comfort you can have on the numbers that have been presented. Next slide, please. And then just FYI, let you know, coming down the pike for 23, there are some standards that are being put in place for the GASB. In their research noted that there appeared to be a higher level of public-private partnerships going on throughout the United States. And so they wanted to put some guides out there so that entities would be comparable consistently, presenting their information in the same way. So again, this is probably not going to relate to 98% of my clients, but I want to make you aware that these new standards are coming out, will be required to be put in place for 6/30/23 if you find yourself in a relationship such as the PPPs. And then also finally, because of how so many businesses and operations and so forth are getting up into the cloud, web services and so forth, they put some guidance out for subscription-based information technology agreements, basically your cloud services. Again, to make sure that people across the board are presenting that, recording it, disclosing it consistently across the states, to make sure that the statements will have be as relevant and as knowledgeable as possible for the reader to understand the relationships that are falling under this subscription-based information. Again, this is not going to be relevant to every one of my clients, but I just want to make you aware that that's out there, and I'll be talking with finance management over these last 2 pages to make sure, throughout the entire calendar year that we're in, well, fiscal year we're in now, and then all into next fall, to make sure that if there's any, these are relevant, that we'll make sure we're tackling them properly and presenting them properly in the year that they are due. And those are my required communications with 2 slides at the end for, hey, here's what's coming down the pike that may or may not be relevant to you. GASB does reserve the right to change their mind a lot and put out more guidance, and so it's a revolving wheel. But these are the ones that are, if they were going to be relevant, that we. Hasn't come up yet, but basically questions or comments.
Lose them?
Rob?
Rob, are you still there?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, okay, we lost you on video for a moment, so.
Oh, good for you though. Look at this. Look at this mug.
So I think what you were saying was that concludes your report. Does anybody have any questions for Rob? Anybody on the phone with questions related to the audit? All right, I think we're good then.
I just wanted to say before Rob, before you go, it was good working with your team, very professional, and we look forward to going forward. I think we have at least 2 more years on a contract and maybe a couple of renewals. So thanks to you and your team.
Oh, thank you. And as I mentioned, getting your statements out the way you did in the first year of existence, with so many things going on in your operations, it's a testament to you and your crew's ability, professionalism, background, knowledge, understanding that you were able to get this done in the time period you did.
Great. Thank you very much. We appreciate that. Thank you, Steve, as well. We do have one action item that we need to take related to the amended FY22 budget. We got a presentation on that earlier. We would like to get a motion. I should note as well that the Finance Committee did review it this morning and did also vote to recommend that that amended budget be forwarded to the board for approval. And so we do need to approve that. I believe was there a resolution in the package, I believe, was there. And this is just for the amended FY22 budget. We will be taking action on the FY23 budget at the February meeting, which in that case would be to forward the 23 budget to the CTB. But for this one, it would be adoption of the FY22 amended budget. So, any questions? Okay. Would anybody like to make a motion, or?
I'll move.
Okay, great.
Second that motion.
Great. All right, so all in favor?
Aye.
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 Great. Any opposed? Okay, thank you very much. And so now we are going to have a presentation. I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for our closed session to discuss some of the information we sent you related to Norfolk Southern. Emily is going to give us a quick presentation on a few studies that we have done in response to request by the General Assembly. And so those reports, once they are forwarded to the General Assembly, are also public information. Steve, do you have one more thing?
Yes, if I may, sorry. On the audit, the actual audited financial statements, I cannot remember if I forwarded it to the full board, so we will make sure you get that this afternoon. And if I didn't send it, please accept my apologies.
Okay, great, thank you. So there are 3 studies here in particular that we'll be discussing related to passenger rail expansion. And I'll let Emily go ahead and get started.
Thank you very much, Director Mitchell. Thanks for having me. Again, Emily Stock, DRPT Rail Chief, and I'll be talking about the intercity passenger rail related General Assembly studies that some have gone to the General Assembly already, some are about to go. Next slide, please. We had 3 that we focused on this past year. We had one for Bedford, one for Bristol, and one for what's known as the Commonwealth Corridor, and I'll show you a map in a minute. For all 3 of these studies, we looked at potential costs and potential ridership. I'll start out for long-term expansions of passenger rail, so long-term plans for expansion of passenger rail. And as you all are aware, VPRA is focused on all things passenger rail. DRPT is still does work on long-range plans like this and like the Virginia statewide rail plan. Next slide. So for Bedford, DRPT has actually been working with local groups in the Bedford area for a couple of years now on a feasibility study that we already had underway and just recently completed to look at the potential for expansion of rail to a rail stop to Bedford, that Roanoke service that goes up to Lynchburg and eventually to the Northeast Corridor, where it goes right by Bedford. And we estimated the cost of a new rail station there and the potential ridership that we could expect for a stop at Bedford. And then the General Assembly asked us to work with Norfolk Southern to do rail traffic controller modeling to see what type of freight improvements might be needed in order to accommodate that service, because of course this is on a Norfolk Southern rail line. So next slide. So I'll go ahead and report the results of both of those studies, both for the DRPT-led study. We looked at a potential station location that was just east of downtown, and we expect that the construction cost for the preferred location is about $11 million. And for this study and for the other studies that I'll be talking about, I'm happy to talk with you all about this in more detail. I know we're a little pressed for time today, but I'm happy to tell you more about this. And of course, the full reports will be available for you to review as well. And the very good news was that when we worked with Norfolk Southern, their results showed that that operations modeling showed non-material new delay for Norfolk Southern freight operations with service included in this study. So that was great news. That meant that we didn't have to add anything to that $11 million to do capital improvements on the freight side, freight operations side. So that's wonderful. And then we also did a ridership analysis, and we looked at the total ridership that we would expect to come to Bedford. And then we also looked at what the incremental ridership would be, because we know that putting a station between existing Roanoke station and the existing Lynchburg station means that we would probably siphon off some riders from those stations as well. But even with that, we're looking at ridership of about 10,000 per year at Bedford, which puts it online with Quantico or Ashland, so somewhere between Quantico and Ashland. So I can move on to the next slide. And some of our next steps, we did apply for a CRISI planning grant with the Federal Railroad Administration. We're waiting to hear back from that, but late in November, we applied for some additional funding to do a NEPA study that would lead to further design and ultimately implementation, hopefully, depending on funding availability moving forward. But we are going to be starting an Amtrak Thruway bus to serve Bedford in spring of 2022 is what we're estimating. So that's another great development that will help us to understand what the demand might be for a rail stop at Bedford. Next slide, please. So the next study that we looked at, another long-range potential expansion for passenger rail is to extend passenger rail to Bristol. And as you all know, we're looking at passenger rail expansion to Christiansburg right now, so this would build upon that. And I don't want to undersell the fact for this study and for the Commonwealth Corridor study that I'll talk about, that the host railroad has not evaluated or agreed to the proposed future service. So we've let the host railroads know about these studies that are out there, both for Bristol and Commonwealth Corridor, but they have not agreed to the proposed service, and that's work that we would need to do as this moves forward. So we reviewed a number of previous studies that were developed to look at Bristol service, the potential cost and benefit of Bristol service, to understand the methodology for ridership and for cost estimates, so we weren't starting at square one. But the current study is an independent estimate that builds on that earlier work and looks at updated service assumptions, especially now that we have Roanoke service under our belts. Next slide, please. Great. And so one item that I want to point out, and this has a huge bearing for the potential for capital investment, the potential for capital costs for service between Christiansburg and Bedford, is a location that's chosen for a New River Valley site. So the New River Valley station assessment is being done right now by VPRA. They're looking at some different options there. And so there are a few different corridors where that station could go. We talked about a mall site. There's also a site called the Merrimack site. And depending on where that ends up, it's possible that there would need to be a passenger rail tunnel built if one of the station locations on this northern Whitehorn District line is chosen. So that's something to keep in mind, because there's going to be a big range of capital cost estimates in the next slide. So capital costs, we are looking at somewhere between $500 million and $1.5 billion. And so that tunnel that I was talking about along the Whitehorn District route, we're thinking would be about $1 billion to build. And so a lot will hinge on that station location that's being decided in New River Valley. We're thinking for operations and maintenance costs, we're looking at $5 million to $5.6 million per year, and there would be an offset depending on ridership that would come into play. And then with regard to ridership, again, because this is long range, we are looking at somewhere between 10,000 and 15,500 riders per year to a station in Bristol. So next slide. Next steps for Bristol, we have had a conversation, as Jennifer mentioned earlier, with the state of Tennessee. It would be great to be able to partner with Tennessee and look at extending this not just to the northeast corridor, but also down toward Atlanta as services are ramping up toward the south too, because of the geography of this area and the amount of time that it takes to get from Bristol, to the northeast corridor. And there is a southeast regional rail plan that FRA put out not too long ago. And it does show an emerging route between Bristol and Knoxville down to Chattanooga and Atlanta. So we'd like to continue that conversation with the Southeast Rail Coalition, or Commission, I'm sorry, of which Tennessee is a member, and Georgia. And then continue to work with localities in the region on the number of stops that we may consider between New River Valley and Bristol. And of course, working with Norfolk Southern as well. Next slide, please. I'll move over to the proposed Commonwealth Corridor study. This is a corridor that would stretch from Hampton Roads through Richmond, then over to Charlottesville, and then down that Western Rail corridor to Lynchburg, Roanoke, and eventually the New River Valley. So we looked at a statewide travel demand model to identify popular submarkets that helped define this route. Next slide, please. And we did quite a bit of public outreach. We did some surveys to figure out how this would work, because it was really not, this isn't a corridor that's gone through a lot of study, like the way that Bristol and Bedford have. So we found that most of the people who were answering the survey really preferred a one-seat ride. It wasn't necessarily small local trips. This is passengers who would want to go the entire corridor. We looked at 2 daily round trips between Newport News and the New River Valley Station in Christiansburg. That was one of the assumptions that we made early on to make this service worthwhile. Next slide. So we found along that corridor, and you may have noticed that there is a portion of that corridor that goes along the Buckingham Branch Railroad between Charlottesville and Doswell, just north of Richmond. And we found that the areas that needed the most improvement include that Charlottesville to Doswell section that currently has no passenger rail service. The other corridors along the way do have passenger rail service now. And we do know that we would have to have a storage and servicing facility at either end of the route as well. We'd have to look at that in the future. And but the good thing is that all segments of the corridor do have existing track now. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we modeled 2 daily round trips between Newport News and Christiansburg. We found that this service could draw as many as 169,400 potential annual passengers. And the capital cost would range from $319 million to $416 million in 2030 dollars. And the O&M costs would be somewhere around $27 million, and there may be some offsets there for the ridership that we get in that area. But these, of course, are looking far into the future. We did use 2021 dollars for capital costs, but there's a lot of work that would need to be done to see exactly how this service would work, especially work with the railroads themselves. Next slide, please. I think that might be all of my slides, and I went very fast because I wanted to leave you all lots of time to talk about your next agenda item. Are there any questions now that you all can think of? If not, I can answer questions offline. I'm happy to do that.
Any questions for Emily?
I don't usually like to ask questions, but I'm going to ask this. The Bedford effort, I may have missed it. What's the time frame that you're looking at for that?
So we are looking at adding an Amtrak Thruway bus in sometime this spring or summer, and that's something that VPRA is working actively with Amtrak to get started. We want to give it the best chance of success given the COVID issues that we've had. And then a lot of this is going to depend on availability of funding, but right now we do have an application in right now for funding a NEPA study that would get us to the next step with the Federal Railroad Administration, and then allow us to apply for further design and construction later on.
And you mentioned that the number that you anticipate with Bedford was 10 to 12,000?
That's right.
Which is similar to Quantico?
Yes.
I mean, all I would simply say for the record is, I imagine the benefit to each one of those individuals in Bedford would be pretty doggone large, and obviously going down to the River Valley. So keep up the good work.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for your time.
We have a very active and group of advocates there. I forgot what BFRRI stands for, but we've had
Bedford Franklin Regional Rail Initiative.
That's right, and but we've had a very cooperative role with them throughout the whole study that we did, and have really appreciated the help that they've provided. So
I'm sure they'll give you as much as you need, if not more.
Thank you.
Okay. So with that, we now are going to go into closed session. I believe our vice chair has a motion.
I do, Madam Chairman. I would move that the board convene in a closed session pursuant to Section 2.2-3711A6 of the Code of Virginia for the purpose of discussing a project involving the investment of public funds where bargaining is involved and where the financial interest of the Commonwealth would be adversely affected if the discussion were made public at this time, and pursuant to A11, for consultation with legal counsel and briefings by staff members or consultants pertaining to probable litigation where such consultation or briefing in open meeting would adversely affect the negotiating or litigating posture of the public body. Additionally, I move that staff and attorneys attend the closed session because their presence is deemed necessary and will aid the board in its consideration of this matter. And if someone seconds that motion, we would then have a roll call.
Okay, do we have a second?
Second.
Okay, great. Joan, could you call the roll, please?
Sure. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say nay. Ms. Belova?
Aye.
Ms. Butler Painter? Aye. Mr. Cardwell? Aye. Ms. Dorsch? Aye. Mr. Fizette? Aye. Mr. Hall? Aye. Mr. Mormon?
Aye.
Ms. Moses Ned?
Aye.
Mr. Nichols?
Aye.
Mr. Sadid? Mr. Spoor? Ms. Zimmerman?
Aye.
Great, thank you. So let me just make sure that our IT is. Yeah. All right, great. Vice Chair, would you like to read the statement?
We are now going to take a roll call vote, and members should say aye if they agree with the following, or abstain. Well, no, not for this. Let's see. To the best of our knowledge, during the closed meeting, the only matters heard, discussed, or considered were those matters lawfully exempted from open meeting requirements under the Virginia Freedom of Information Act, and only those public business matters as were identified in the motion by which the closed session or closed meeting was convened. So moved.
Right, is there a second? Okay. Joan, will you call the roll call?
Absolutely. Ms. Belova?
Aye.
Ms. Butler Painter? Aye. Mr. Cardwell? Aye. Ms. Dorsch? Aye. Mr. Fizette? Aye. Mr. Hall? Aye. Mr. Mormon?
Aye.
Ms. Moses Ned?
Aye.
Mr. Nichols?
Aye.
Mr. Sadid? Mr. Spoor? Ms. Zimmerman?
Aye.
All right, thank you. So now we would like to, and as DJ noted, we did send out a decision brief and resolution as well, which we would like to put to a vote as well. So would anyone like to make a motion?
Madam Chairman, I'm happy to move the resolution, which is authorization of execution of comprehensive rail agreement between Norfolk Southern Railway Company and the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority.
Great, thank
So
you. Is there
moved.
a second?
Second, Hall.
All right, thank you. All right, we're going to do this as a roll call vote as well.
You got it. Ms. Belova?
Aye.
Ms. Butler Painter? Mr. Cardwell? Ms. Dorsch? Mr. Fizette? Mr. Hall? Mr. Mormon?
I abstain.
Ms. Moses Ned?
Aye.
Mr. Nichols?
Aye.
Mr. Sadid? Mr. Spoor? Ms. Zimmerman?
Aye.
All right, so the motion passes. Very exciting. Well.
Thank you all.
Yeah, that's all we have today, unless anybody else has any other business they'd like to bring up. All right, thank you all for coming. It's good to see everybody in person. Our next board meeting will be February 1st. At that time, we'll also be taking action on the FY23 budget, but we'll have more information about the agenda going forward. So,
And
all right, thank you all.
There had been a meeting that was in a previous calendar for, I think it was January 25th or something like that.
Yeah, we can
and
take
that's-
that one off the calendar.
Take that off.
We'll make sure that Actually, what we'll do, we'll make sure we send you new calendar invitations and that you've got everything.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep, all right. Thank you to everybody on the phone as well.
Thank you.
So we are adjourned.